Hello everyone, I am the Sleepy Storyteller and today I will share with you stories before you fall asleep. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment below where you are watching this video. We start right now. The storm raged against the old mansion like a feral beast, its claws of wind and rain raking the weathered stones. Nestled deep in the woods, the Merrill house had stood for centuries, its history woven with whispered tales of madness, betrayal, and blood. Tonight, the house seemed alive, groaning and creaking under the assault, as if protesting the darkness encroaching within. Evelyn tightened her shawl around her shoulders as she lit a candle in the drawing room. She had come to Merrill house reluctantly, summoned by the will of her estranged uncle, Horace. The letter had been cryptic, urging her to claim her inheritance before it was too late. She had arrived just as the storm broke. The forest path twisting and treacherous, guiding her to the house like a predator leading prey, the interior was a mausoleum of shadows and dust. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every move. Evelyn placed the candle on a table, its flickering light casting eerie shapes that danced across the cracked wallpaper. The will, sealed in an envelope marked with an ornate wax crest, lay unopened beside her. The lawyer who had handed it to her had refused to enter the house, his demeanor as pale as the lightning flashing outside. She broke the seal. The parchment within was brittle, the ink faded but legible, "To my dearest Evelyn. By the time you read this, I will have departed this wretched world. The Merrill name, once proud, has been cursed by our deeds. The house. It hungers. You must find the key and end its torment. Do not linger once the task is done. Burn the house and leave, for your life and soul depend on it. Forgive me for what I have burdened you with. You are the last hope." A crash of thunder rattled the windows, and Evelyn's breath caught as the candle sputtered. Her uncle's words were the ravings of a madman, yet unease coiled in her stomach. The house felt aware, its silence not of peace but of watchfulness. Resolving to leave as soon as the storm allowed, she folded the will and placed it back on the table. But something caught her eye. A glint of metal embedded in the fireplace's stonework. She approached cautiously, her pulse quickening. It was a key, ornate and ancient, its surface etched with cryptic symbols. She pulled it free, and as she did, the air in the room grew heavy, oppressive. The portraits seemed to lean forward, their expressions twisting with malevolence. A low, guttural whisper echoed through the room. It wasn't her imagination. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a symphony of despair that chilled her to the bone. Evelyn. Her name slithered through the air like a serpent. She backed away, clutching the key, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows deepened, swallowing the light. The house groaned, a sound that resonated like a monstrous heartbeat. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The only reply was a cold, hollow laugh, driven by both terror and curiosity. Evelyn fled the room and ascended the grand staircase, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The hallway above was a labyrinth of doors, each marked with strange carvings. She tried to make sense of them, but her thoughts were clouded by the growing sense of being watched. One door, larger and more ornate than the rest, drew her like a moth to flame. The key seemed to vibrate in her hand as she approached. The carvings on the door matched those on the key, an intricate language she couldn't comprehend. She hesitated, but the whispering returned, more insistent now. "Open it, Evelyn. Free us." The words filled her head, drowning her reason. Her fingers trembled as she inserted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in a sickly green glow. At its center stood a pedestal, and upon it, a book bound in what appeared to be human skin. The whispers became a cacophony as she approached. The book pulsed, as if alive, its pages fluttering despite the still air. Against her better judgment, Evelyn reached out and opened it. The inked words writhed and shifted, forming sentences before her eyes. The house feeds. Blood binds. Only sacrifice will sate its hunger. The door slammed shut behind her, and the room plunged into chaos. Shadows peeled from the walls, coalescing into monstrous shapes. Evelyn screamed as the specters surrounded her, their faces twisted masks of agony and rage. "You cannot escape," they intoned. "You must choose, flee and doom the world, or stay and sate the hunger." Evelyn's mind reeled. The book's pages turned on their own, revealing an illustration of a knife and a ritual circle. She realized the symbols matched those etched into the floor around the pedestal. Despair washed over her. Her uncle hadn't been mad, he had been desperate. I can't," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You must," the shadows demanded. One specter, more solid than the others, stepped forward. It bore the face of her uncle, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Forgive me, Evelyn," he said. "It was always meant to be you." He extended his hand, and in it appeared the knife from the illustration. Evelyn shook her head, backing away, but the shadows closed in, leaving her no escape. Her screams echoed through the mansion, rising above the storm. Then there was silence. When the sun rose, the storm had passed, but Marrow House remained dark and still. Its windows reflected nothing, its walls emanating a cold that kept the curious at bay. Evelyn was never seen again, and the mansion's legacy of terror lived on, whispered among those who dared speak its name. And deep within, the house waited, hungering for its next victim. The next story, the small, isolated town of Hollow Bend lay nestled in a valley, perpetually shrouded in mist even on the brightest days. It was the kind of place that held secrets like roots held the earth, deep and tangled, unseen but ever present. At the heart of the town, where cobblestone streets converged in a crooked square, stood the Weaver's Inn, a decrepit structure with a history that locals avoided discussing. They called it cursed, but never allowed. Ruth Hargrave arrived on a cold, moonless night, her car sputtering to a halt just outside the inn. She was a journalist with a reputation for chasing legends, and the story of Hollow Bend had lured her like a moth to a flame. Stories of disappearances, eerie lights in the woods, and whispers of an ancient presence were too enticing to resist. The inn loomed before her, its windows darkened, its facade blanketed in ivy that seemed to cling like desperate fingers. She pushed open the creaking door, and the scent of damp wood and decay met her. The interior was dimly lit by an oil lamp on the counter, where a gaunt man sat reading a yellowed newspaper. He looked up, his sunken eyes narrowing at the sight of her. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice gravelly, each word laced with warning. "I have a reservation," Ruth replied, forcing a polite smile. The man stared at her for a long moment before sliding a rusted key across the counter. "Room 7, he muttered. "Keep to yourself, and don't go wandering." The hallway leading to her room was lined with faded wallpaper that seemed to ripple in the flickering light. The floorboards groaned under her steps, each sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. When she reached room 7, she hesitated. The air was thick, charged with something she couldn't name. Brushing off her unease, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was sparse, a single bed with a sagging mattress, a wardrobe with one door hanging askew, and a window that overlooked the dense forest surrounding the town. Ruth set her bag down and retrieved her notebook. The locals might have been tight-lipped, but the land had its own way of speaking, and she intended to listen. As she drifted off to sleep, a faint sound stirred her. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. Her eyes snapped open, and she scanned the room, her heart pounding. The noise was coming from the wardrobe. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but her curiosity won out. She approached cautiously and pulled the door open. Inside was nothing but darkness. Yet the tapping continued, louder now, echoing from somewhere deep within. It didn't make sense. The wardrobe was shallow, its back clearly visible. Ruth reached inside, and her hand brushed against something cold. A sudden, bone-deep chill swept over her. And the tapping ceased. Her reflection in the wardrobe mirror seemed to shift, her expression twisting into something unfamiliar before reverting back. The following day, Ruth ventured into the town, determined to dig deeper. The townsfolk were evasive, their eyes darting away when she mentioned the inn or the forest. One old woman, clutching a string of wooden beads, muttered a single word, the hollowing. It was evening when she returned to her room, her head buzzing with fragmented tales of disappearances and strange lights. She sat by the window, staring out at the forest. The mist had thickened, coiling around the trees like smoke. As she watched, a faint glow appeared among the trunks. Pulsing like a heartbeat, compelled by a force she couldn't explain, Ruth grabbed her flashlight and coat and ventured outside. The air was colder than before, and the silence was absolute, as if the forest itself held its breath. The light drew her in, leading her deeper into the woods, the trees closing in like skeletal hands. She found herself in a clearing where the ground was unnaturally bare, a perfect circle devoid of vegetation. At its center stood a stone altar, ancient and weathered, etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when she looked at them. The glow emanated from the altar, casting long, sinister shadows. A voice echoed in the clearing, low and guttural, speaking in a language she didn't understand. Ruth froze, her flashlight flickering. The shadows began to move, coalescing into forms that were almost human but grotesquely wrong. Their eyes burned with the same eerie light as the altar. "You should not have come," one of them said, its voice resonating in her mind rather than her ears. "The hollowing demands its due." Ruth stumbled back, but the figures surrounded her, their movements unnaturally fluid. She tried to run, but the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, pulling her toward the altar. Her screams echoed through the forest, swallowed by the mist. When she awoke, she was back in her room at the inn, the morning light streaming through the window. She bolted upright, her heart racing. Had it all been a dream? But her muddy boots and the strange symbols etched into her arms told her otherwise. Ruth packed her things and fled Hollow Bend, but the town stayed with her. In the weeks that followed, she found herself drawn to dark places, her reflection often shifting in mirrors. The symbols on her arms burned when she tried to ignore them, and her dreams were filled with whispers and the glow of the altar. And in Hollow Bend, the mist thickened, the townsfolk's gazes growing darker. The hollowing had begun again, and the town would endure, feeding the ancient hunger that bound it. Ruth's story became part of the legend, a warning for those who might wander too close. But the forest remained, patient and hungry, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble into its grasp. The next story. The icy wind screamed through the desolate expanse of the Arctic, carrying with it the promise of death. Dr. Nora Carter huddled inside the rusted outpost, her fingers trembling as she scratched notes onto a yellowing journal. The base had been abandoned for years, swallowed by the endless white wilderness, but now it was alive again, though not with anything she could name. She had come here to study the frozen core samples taken from beneath the ice. For weeks, she and her team had drilled into the untouched glacier, believing they were uncovering history, evidence of a forgotten past. They had found more than they bargained for. Nora's hands shook as she wrote the last entry in her journal. "We were not the first. Something was here long before the ice covered it. Something that sleeps, but not peacefully. I fear it has awoken." The sound of heavy boots crunching on the frost-coated metal floor made her freeze. Her eyes darted to the door of the room, half expecting it to burst open. But the noise passed, retreating into the distance. The others had already gone, one by one, lured into the howling storm by whispers none of them could explain. Whispers that had begun when they unearthed the black monolith. The monolith had been buried 2 miles beneath the ice, a slab of unearthly material unlike anything they'd seen. It emitted no heat, no energy that their instruments could detect. But everyone had felt its pull. The longer they stayed near it, the harder it was to look away. People had grown restless, aggressive, paranoid. And then the whispers started. Not voices, exactly, but fragments of thought, threading through their minds like icy needles. Nora had stayed behind while the others went to the excavation site one last time. When they hadn't returned, she tried to call for help. The radio was nothing but static, the satellite phone dead. The storm had rolled in with unnatural speed, sealing her off from the world. She was alone, or so she told herself. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Her breath caught, her pulse hammering in her ears. When the emergency lights buzzed to life, casting the room in an eerie red glow, she saw the frost creeping across the walls. It spread like veins, racing toward her. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air seemed to thrum with energy. Then she heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, echoing through the base. Nora grabbed the nearest object, a wrench, and moved toward the door. Her instincts screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. Outside was the storm, an endless abyss of white death. The corridor beyond the door stretched into shadow, the red lights flickering intermittently. She stepped forward, each creak of the floor echoing like a gunshot. The growl came again. Closer this time. It was followed by a wet, slithering sound that made her skin crawl. As she reached the central hub of the outpost, she stopped. The monolith was there, somehow brought back to the base. It loomed in the center of the room, blacker than night, its surface pulsing like a heartbeat. The air around it shimmered, and Nora could see faint figures in the distortion, faces pressed against an invisible barrier, mouths open in silent screams. Dr. Carter. The voice made her spin around, the wrench raised defensively. It was Thompson, one of her team members. But his eyes were wrong, pale and lifeless, the pupils blown wide. His skin was frostbitten, his lips cracked and blue. "You need to join us," he said, his voice hollow. "It's beautiful. You'll understand when you see it." Nora backed away, shaking her head. "You're not Thompson." He smiled, a grotesque twisting of his face. "We're all Thompson now. We're all one. Soon, you will be too." Behind him, more figures emerged from the shadows. They were her team, or what was left of them. Their bodies moved stiffly, like puppets on strings. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the pulse of the monolith. They closed in, their hands reaching for her. Nora turned and ran, the wrench slipping from her grasp. She barreled through the narrow corridors, the frost spreading faster now, creeping up her boots. The whispers filled her mind, drowning her thoughts. They promised peace, unity, an end to the cold loneliness of existence. All she had to do was surrender. She burst into the lab and slammed the door behind her. The whispers quieted, but the frost continued to spread. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on a small box of explosives they'd used for controlled blasts during the excavation. Her hands trembled as she wired the charges, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The door buckled, then burst open. The figures flooded in, their eyes fixed on her. Thompson stepped forward, his voice soft, almost kind. "You can't stop it, Nora. It's already begun." She lit the fuse. The explosion rocked the outpost, sending a plume of fire and smoke into the storm. When the snow settled, there was nothing left but charred remains and silence. The monolith was gone, buried once more beneath the ice. But the whispers lingered, carried on the wind, seeping into the dreams of those who ventured too close, and deep beneath the glacier, something stirred, patient and eternal, waiting for the ice to release it again. The next story. More than anything in the world, I hate being tickled. And it all started on my 11th birthday, when the boys and I decided to climb around an abandoned building on the outskirts of our city. They say that back in the Tsarist times, there was a mansion of some landowner there. Then they organized some kind of museum there after the revolution. During the war, the museum was almost completely destroyed. When the Germans retreated, they stole everything they could carry, and burned what they couldn't. After the war, the museum was restored, but then, for unknown reasons, it was closed. Why was it closed, you ask? Well, here, my friends, is the real meat and potatoes. They say that the gentleman who lived here went nuts on the basis of the occult, like the characters from Lovecraftian horrors. He collected antiquities, manuscripts, figurines, stones. He was always looking for a way to open the gates to other dimensions, obtain higher knowledge and learn to subjugate the inhabitants of those planes. Well, sort of like our own Alhazard, only without the Necronomicon. And, well, it seems like he succeeded in something. Because, they say, he suddenly disappeared. His wife hanged herself, along with her 3 beautiful daughters, well, or they were helped. And certainly not by people, judging by the scraps of tales and stories. After that, the entire household and servants went nuts. Well, and then, somehow, everything calmed down, well, after the war, they say. The museum staff and visitors complained of a strange feeling of ill health, depression and headaches. Then, the staff began to suffer from constant nightmares. In short, someone even ended up in Kashchenko. So, the museum did not become more than a house with devilry, but became famous throughout the area. In which local boys, including me, could test their toughness. In short, we arrived there when the sun was already setting. Against the backdrop of the forest drowning in shadows, the ominous house seemed even more creepy. If I had known what was waiting for us there, if I had listened to my inner voice, which was screaming that I shouldn't go there. But what can I do now? Moreover, I made a bet with the local alpha male that I would get a tile from the stove, or some other trinket. Of course. I wanted to measure something. What, don't you remember yourself as a child? That's it. So, me, my friend Vavochka, and the alpha male's buddy Antoka walked into the jaws of fear. At first, everything went well. I climbed into the house, climbing over a broken, half-rotted window, and stomped into the cold, moldy darkness. I still shudder when I remember its sticky, enveloping touch. The rotten boards creaked menacingly under my feet, and I tried not to shit myself from the wave of horror that washed over me. I stepped unluckily on a completely rotten board and fell into the cellar with a scream and a crash. Naturally, I lost the flashlight, but at least I remained in one piece, although my butt and back hurt terribly, and when I fell, the air was knocked out of my lungs. Groaning, I rose to my feet. Fedka, alive? Flashed from above. The boys, to their credit, rushed to my rescue, but so far they couldn't find me, alive. I responded. Help me get out. Where are you? Right here. Right under your nose, just you wait, we'll get you out. And then I was overwhelmed by a wave of not just fear, or horror. I don't even know how to describe it. In general, it's like when you start to drown, and you understand that there is almost no chance of getting out. Or when a hare understands the whole hopeless nightmare of its situation when it finds itself in the jaws of a wolf. In the moment when the fangs bite through the flesh, and you feel the pain and the flow of blood through your body. It was not just horror. It was even harder, even more insane, even more hopeless. It was a pure instinct, known to our distant ancestors, when they huddled in caves, warming themselves by meager hearths, pressing themselves to the saving light of the fire and casting fearful glances into the darkness of the ancient night. It was an inexplicable, pure, transcendental horror. I felt that I was not alone here, and that something was sliding towards me in the darkness, breathing a foul, intermittent breath. But was it breath? Could it breathe? Something touched the bare skin of my hands, breathing an icy stench on the back of my head. Goosebumps ran across my skin. Or maybe it wasn't them, but tiny spider legs tickled me, and there were more and more of them. It was as if something was entwining me, enveloping me, and I couldn't even scream. I was paralyzed. Suddenly, a flashlight hit my face. "Fedka, get out." Vavochka shone the light right in my face. It let me go and I rushed towards the light. "Guys!" I screamed, "Help me out, Fedka, you, what the, is this, a?" And Toka let out a girlish squeal. "Guys, don't give up." I begged, almost sobbing. I jumped on some junk, lost my balance, waved my arms in horror, fell. Out of the corner of my eye I caught sight of something that made the hairs on all my arms stand on end. Hanging over me, hanging, I don't even know what. Shapeless, broken, wrong. Something that doesn't exist, that should never exist in our world. Never. And it stretched its ugly, elongated limbs towards me, like fused spider legs, or tentacles with writhing hairs. I howled at the top of my lungs. Not feeling the pain from my bruises, I rushed towards the light again. "Guys!" I begged, holding out my hands to them. "Grab hold of it, you moron." Vovchik was yelling. Vovchik's red t-shirt flashed in the flickering light of the flashlight. I grabbed it with a death grip. I was jerked upward. Something grabbed my right leg, like a rough, prickly rope tightened around it in a tight knot. Even through the canvas of my pants, I felt the icy cold. Not from here. Different. The breath of another world, terrible and hostile to all mankind. I screamed again, wildly, losing my voice, and began to kick. My leg was torn out of its joint. Vova's t-shirt also began to crack and fall apart menacingly. "No. I don't want to. MOM. MOO." The boy's hands grabbed my forearms and shoulders. With a desperate effort, with strained cries that turned into shrieks, they pulled me toward themselves, dragging me onto the floorboards. Without saying a word, we ran away. So fast that our feet barely touched the boards. And then the ground. We calmed down only when we ran onto the playground near our house. Grandma and Grandpa had to give us valerian instead of tea. And we were shaking all the time. Stuttering, we kept muttering about a scary house and a monster in it. They say that ghosts are usually tied to a certain place. So that scarecrow won't be able to escape from the house either. But what if it's not a ghost at all? What if it's the creature that the crazy master summoned from other worlds? All in all, I had a great time on my birthday. Since then I hate tickling, yes, and, I must admit, I also began to be panicky afraid of the dark from that time on. As soon as I turn off the light at night, I am again overcome by a horror similar to the one I experienced in the abandoned estate. And sometimes it seems to me that that creature from the abandoned mansion, it's nearby, and someday, she will come for me and drag me into the eternally hungry darkness. The next story, a light mist hung over the surface of the river. Night birds chirped from the darkness, and cicadas chirped along with them. Twilight is a great time to go fishing. Few people go out fishing at such a time, which is what Simon took advantage of. At such moments you can truly relax and enjoy the atmosphere of nature. And most importantly, a good catch. Before lowering the boat, Simon looked at the water surface. Fry were playing on the bottom, timidly swimming to the shore. Lightly touched the transparent surface, and they would scatter in different directions. The boat was now moving. Simon jumped in and swam deep into the river. A light breeze blew in his back, making hundreds of goosebumps run down his spine. The guy shuddered, wrapping himself in a warm jacket even more. Having swum away from the shore enough, Simon took up the fishing rod. The first time he didn't have to wait long. The fish took the bait in a couple of minutes. The good old worm with a special additive always helps. He cast the second time. This time he had to wait a little longer. The fishing was going great. Half of the bucket was already filled, another one was ready. Simon got excited, forgot about time, and not only about that. He was so hooked on fishing that he thought only about fish and the river, which had no end or edge. He didn't even notice how a strange-looking fish swam up to his boat. Quite large, roundish in shape and angular sides, and its head, looked somewhat like a human. As soon as Simon looked overboard to wash his hands, the strange fish swam away. The guy noticed this, began to peer into the water, but the fish was no longer visible. It must have seemed like it. He thought, picking up the fishing rod again, and as soon as he cast, suddenly the fish jumped out of the water, clinging to Simon's hand. The guy screamed, grabbed the creature by the tail and began to pull, but it did not give in. The teeth were so deeply embedded in the flesh that it was impossible to tear it off. He had to use his fists. After a few blows, the fish flew off his hand, hit the side of the boat and sank into the water. Blood flowed copiously from his hand, streaming onto the water's surface, thereby attracting even more of these creatures. Simon grabbed the wound tightly. Of course, you can't stop the bleeding like that. He had to sacrifice the sleeve of his jacket so that the bleeding would no longer bother him. All that was left was to get out of here. He hadn't managed to swim a few meters before they pounced on him again. This time 3 fish bit through his flesh. All 3 monsters aimed at his forearms, forcing him to let go of the oars. His body convulsed, the pain grew. Simon, unable to fight off the river creatures, began to beat against the sides of the boat. They, although not immediately, but let go, taking pieces of flesh with them. Simon fell to the bottom of the boat, screaming loudly, but no one heard him. Even more creatures swam up. A whole flock, several dozen of these creatures, gathered for the catch. They jumped out of the water, flying over the boat. The guy could only defend himself, slightly raising his bleeding hands. When one of these fish appeared on board, Simon quickly grabbed the oar, sat down and smashed its head with a few blows. With difficulty he rose, began to swing the oar, driving away the monsters, and there were more and more of them. Several dozen, a whole 100, now it was impossible to fight off such a horde. The oar broke from such a battle. Soon everything went quiet as Simon grabbed the second oar. The water monsters stopped terrorizing the guy. Simon stood there for a minute, ready for battle, until the tension in his body subsided. While there was still time, he had to swim away. It was quite difficult with one oar, impossible to swim. His arms hurt terribly. The shore was still far away. The guy hoped that someone would hear him, but again there was emptiness. His listener was a plea for help. Simon was completely desperate, which is why he grabbed his head and cried. He would have to sit in the middle of the river until the morning, hoping that someone would find him during the day. Suddenly the water began to bubble in front of the boat's bow. Simon paid attention to it. Each time the bubbles became larger, a small wave appeared in that place and headed towards the boat, increasing in size. This wave turned out to be very unusual. Those creatures approached their victim in a whole wall, raising a water flow. Simon covered himself with his hands, although he knew that it would hardly help him. The wave of their river monsters covered him, swallowing him up along with the boat. 2 fishermen found the boy's body floating on the surface of the water the next day. They noticed his gnawed, scarlet back, with his spine sticking out. The fishermen dropped their fishing rods and ran to call someone. Meanwhile, several of those creatures were swimming closer to the shore. The next story. In one kingdom of a small state, there is no hero in this story. Well, there is one key figure, but he is not a hero. Not even a villain. He is just doing his job. But that is not the point now, his time has not come yet. This story took place during the plague. The plague depopulated many cities, like an avalanche, it spread from one country to another. No one was ready for this, no one expected this. The plague came suddenly and took everyone, sparing no one. Children and the weak were always the first to go, then everyone else. Many medical minds of that time tried to stop the infection, but nothing helped. Prayers and rituals were also powerless. The priests insisted that God was disappointed in people and sent the plague for purification. The madmen screamed about the end of the world, many people took their own lives out of despair. Some were afraid, some simply did not want to fall victim to the plague. Others obediently awaited their fate, abandoning all their affairs or continuing to live. Only a small number still tried to fight, despite the unsuccessful attempts of doctors and priests. If you look from the outside, without delving into the essence of what is happening, it may seem as if everyone has gone crazy. They either climb into nooses, or simply sit like dolls, or imitate everyday routine, puppets under the power of an invisible puppeteer. For example, a blacksmith hits the anvil, hits hard, so that the sword is sharper and stronger. Why? After all, this sharp and strong sword will not be needed by a good fellow who has decided to give his life to defend the motherland. But the blacksmith still hopes for a bright future, hopes that this sword will be taken by a noble young man, hopes that he will continue to forge such swords. From time to time, a spark of doubt flashes in the blacksmith, he stops for a moment, thinks, then continues to work again, dispelling all doubts. But an unpleasant aftertaste still remains. Now let's look at the dressmaker. She sits there, sewing dresses. You might also ask, why? She does this out of habit. There is no hope, she just does her job and that's it. If her fate comes to die, it is God's will. But she still trembles at the mention of infection, she is afraid of a terrible fate. She often thought about leaving this life herself, but she is weak in spirit. Of course, she also sometimes hoped for the best, that she would continue to sew dresses for beautiful ladies, that she would continue to sew clothes for the poor and needy. But all these hopes collapsed when she saw a coffin carried down the street and the ringing of bells. All that was left was to simply embroider jackets and dresses, which are unlikely to be needed by anyone now. Perhaps only by the dead. You don't have to go far for dolls. For example, there's the beautiful Dolores. A famous dancer from one old pub, who always amazed everyone with her angelic innocence, sometimes a bit silly, and at the same time a beloved virtuous woman. Now her pale skin has faded, her blue eyes are staring blindly into nowhere, having lost their shine. Her plump body has become a bag of bones. No, she didn't eat, it's just that stress has affected the poor thing. That's what Dolores' mother, who so diligently takes care of her beautiful daughter, thought. She just ate with difficulty, without much desire, suicides. They have always been there. Despite the fact that such a thing is punishable by God's law, some decided to commit such a terrible act. Like, for example, the eternally drunk and young Gregory. A ladies' man, a frequent guest at balls and in beds, the always cheerful Gregory came to this conclusion: let me go as a sinner, but I will not give myself to more. He no longer saw the point in living, in hoping for the best. He wanted to believe that the plague would go away, that he would again attend balls, that he would again crawl under the dresses of beautiful girls, but at the sight of the dead on the street, tears welled up in his eyes, and all faith shattered like glass. Gregory looked at the noose hanging tightly on the beam. He stood on a stool, stuck his head through the noose, and looked at the window for the last time. Once upon a time, a beautiful view of the city opened up to him, and now only gray houses and darkness, and this has been the case for a long time. After all, it's true, when did the plague come to the city? Those who saw it won't say, they've been sleeping underground for a long time. But Gregory wasn't going to meet more. One push, and he'll disappear into oblivion. Now we come to the guest of this carnival of horror and suffering. Moore himself, a walking dead man, with a swollen plum-colored face. He floated around the city, a dark haze spreading from under his gray robe, penetrating every house, infecting everyone present. In his hands he held an open bag, where the souls of the dead fell, flying out of the houses as white smoke. The only whole eye, spinning in different directions, managed to find the living and control the flow of the dead. Around Moore circled two ugly dwarfs, hunchbacked and crooked, notifying of his arrival. "The dead man is coming," they shouted joyfully. "The dead man is coming." In his sack was half the city. From there came the sad chant of 100 voices. And only Moore enjoyed his own choir. The deadly smoke reached the blacksmith, covering his body with growths. His eyes began to bleed, black vomit burst from his mouth. The blacksmith's strength was leaving him. He dropped the hammer from his mighty hand, right onto his foot, but he felt no pain. His foot turned into a bloody mush of bones and flesh. The blacksmith fell dead near the anvil, hitting his head. Like a porcelain doll, with a broken face, no one needed the blacksmith, gradually decomposing and turning into a skeleton. The fire in the furnace was still burning, the unfinished sword remained on the anvil. It was unlikely that the valiant warrior would take it now. The same thing happened to the dressmaker and the beautiful Dolores. The dressmaker accidentally punctured the growths while she was in agony, touching the jar of needles with her hand, thus hastening her death. Black and red blood painted the walls of the dressmaker's shop. Poor Dolores simply laughed hysterically. Now she looked like a sack of potatoes. Dolores stretched her arms up and screamed, "Let the Lord take care of me at least there, at home." She coughed up black liquid and closed her eyes. Another city fell victim to the plague. Another sack was full. Moore gave the sack to the dwarves and went on, quietly humming a lullaby. There were still plenty of souls ahead, good and bad, sweet and bitter, light and dark. The time would come when he would collect the entire earthly collection. Unless, of course, someone would stop him. But Moore hoped that he would still have time to finish his work. That's the end of the tale. Whoever survives is a fine fellow. The next story. The old man was barely walking, with a heavy armful of brushwood behind him. The blizzard was swirling the snow, pushing the old man back every now and then, so hard that he could barely stand on his feet. His heart was pounding painfully in his chest, sending shivers through his entire body. It was becoming increasingly difficult to breathe, his strength was running out. The old man felt his doom. Death was behind him, holding its sharp scythe in its hands. Bottomless eye sockets stared at the old man, and inside it shone scarlet. A mouth with crooked teeth opened and closed, with a nasty grinding sound. It smelled of swamp and carrion. "What are you doing, old man? Why do you keep fighting? You know that your end is near." Death whispered tenderly in a girlish voice, like a mother singing a lullaby to her baby. "I want to make fun of you, Mother Death. It's not right for me to just die like that," the old man said jokingly, smiling. "You are no longer a child. Your hair has been sitting for a long time, your bones are creaking, your body is not obeying, and you are playing games. Is this possible? People can do anything, everything is permitted, as long as they live, really? Killing children and beating your wife is also allowed." Death was surprised. "If it's to the point, then yes. The old man cursed angrily. I know. I know everything about you, old man. You just beat your wife, but you never loved your children, so you killed them. Oh, what are you saying, mother? I beat my wife for a good cause. She was a bad woman. She was raised that way, her parents were wild. And I killed the children, they were from the devil. My wife was into black magic, it was passed down in her family. You're lying, elder. You're lying to yourself. In your drunken delirium, you imagined all this, and so you believed it. Alcohol has always been your friend. I drank a little, it's possible, isn't it? It helps a lot, especially after a hard day. Yeah, old man, old man. I know you haven't worked. Even now it's hard for you. Because your body isn't used to this. You've been lying on the stove your whole life, eating Easter cakes with alcohol. You're an old fool. You're confusing everything. It wasn't me who led this life, but my brother. He was the biggest slacker the world had ever seen. I worked tirelessly to become at least someone. Look for yourself, elder, and you will understand that I am not lying. Death ran its cold, black hand over the old man's eyes, and his whole life flashed before his eyes. Here he is lying on the hay, eating a freshly cooked chicken with moonshine, grunting contentedly and laughing. Here he is sleeping on the stove, snoring loudly. Here he is beating his wife for daring to contradict him. Here he is killing his 2 sons. He twists the head of the eldest, and then began to butcher him, and he threw the infant into the stove. The old man got angry, threw down an armful of brushwood and began waving his arms, shouting loudly, "You're lying, bitch, you're lying. I wasn't like that, you simply forgot, elder. And you also cursed at my memory. After all, you yourself are now trying to live differently, but you can't escape the past." The old man did not hear old woman death. Fury blocked his ears. Anger filled his fists. He was ready to tear and throw, until a thin voice stopped him. "Father, why are you doing this to us?" He turned towards the voice and saw his sons. The eldest was spread out across the tree branches, one leg on one branch, the other leg on another branch. His arms were crawling along the tree, and his torso was located at the very roots. Next to him a burnt baby was crying loudly. Something round and small flew out of nowhere and fell right into the elder's hands. It was the head of the eldest son. With his whitish eyes he looked straight at his father and said again, "Father, why are you doing this to us?" The old man screamed loudly, throwing out the head of his dead son. Unbearable pain overcame him. A feeling of fear distorted his face. His heart sank under the pressure of his conscience. Everything he wanted to forget was returning. And again a voice was heard, this time a woman's. "Why are you doing this to me, my dear?" The old man's wife appeared before him. She was all pale green, with seaweed instead of hair, small shells instead of nails, webbing between her hands, and her beautiful oval face had become a fish's head. "Why are you doing this to me, my dear?" She repeated, "But you already left me." The old man said through his teeth, "You left for another, you creature. There was no one else, my beloved. I left you and drowned myself in a dark and deep lake. I could not stand your beatings, and gave my body to the calm and cold water." And again the elder screamed. His mind could not bear it. Now he remembered everything. Instead of his wife, death appeared before him again. The old man fell silent, looking at her madly. Silence, and only the blizzard roared. "Now do you understand, elder, that you were wrong? So why are you still holding on? After all, you know that your heart no longer wants to beat, so, my time has come, Mother Death." A silent nod in response. Death approached the old man, leaned towards him and kissed him tenderly. The old man slowly closed his eyes, fell to his knees and collapsed into the snow, which became his blanket and grave. The blizzard sang him a farewell song. The trees swayed, seeing him off on his final journey. With the arrival of spring, a swamp formed in that place. And if you believe the legends, an evil swamp dweller lives there, but few knew that in the mortal court, the old man was punished for all his sins. And now until the end of time, he is obliged to live in an unpleasant body of water, frightening good people. The next story, it was getting dark. The waves were beating against the rocks. On a small island, separated from a large island by the ocean, a lighthouse lantern shone into the distance. A storm broke out. The wind mercilessly slammed the shutters of the lighthouse windows, and it seemed that at any moment they would be torn off. The twilight thickened, darkness fell upon the sky and covered it completely. Only a barely visible beam of the lantern could help the unfortunate sailors get to the port. The boat was tossed from side to side. At the cost of great effort, 2 rowers managed to keep the right course. The third man sat in the middle with a silk bag over his head. Amid the general hubbub, it was impossible to hear that he was praying, only his arms crossed over his chest gave him away. The rowers were dressed in black leather cloaks with hoods. The man praying was dressed in light clothes, a tattered shirt and holey trousers. He was completely frozen, but that was hardly his main problem. For what services was he being taken to the island, and why did the rowers have gloomy faces with sad eyes? The boat was washed up on a wooden pier. One of the rowers went out onto the pier and tied the boat to a block. The second rower brought out a man with a bag over his head. At that moment, the man stopped praying. As soon as the second rower took the bag off him, his gaze froze and his teeth began to chatter. One of the rowers walked ahead, and the second roughly grabbed the shivering man by the elbow and pushed him forward. Realizing what was threatening him, the man burst into tears and fell to his knees. "You are making a terrible mistake. This violates human rights laws," he screamed like a madman. The men in cloaks remained mute to him. The first reached the base of the stairs carved into the rock, while the second looked with indifference on his face at the prisoner, which the man who had given in to his nerves was to them. The 2 in leather cloaks were his executioners. The first one started to climb the stairs. The wind grew stronger, fluttering the hem of his cloak, as if he was fighting the elements. His gloved hands clenched into fists. Menacingly, he climbed up, dropping the soles of his boots onto the stones. "You can't do this to me," the prisoner shouted as the second one lifted him up by the armpits. The man, haggard, trudged forward. The other followed him, pressing him. Until the last step, the prisoner would feel the tension and danger. The second one walked casually, his hands in the pockets of his coat. His comrade had reached the top and was now waiting for them. The prisoner slowly made his way to the stairs. The second executioner was understanding. Their current victim was not the first to do so. It took them at least 30 minutes to climb the stairs. The stairs themselves were high. And the prisoner kept trying to slip. "Don't you understand what they are forcing you to do?" he asked the executioners once again, with a pleading voice, but their faces remained unperturbed. "You are making a huge mistake. I am the same person as you." The first executioner approached the lighthouse, always amazed by the tranquility of this place, where thousands of people had found peace over the last 10 years of his work. With trembling hands, he took out a pack of cigarettes, patted it against his palm and pulled out a cigarette. He lit it and took a drag. Gradually, the trembling in his hand subsided. The wind did not subside, but he did not care. There were worse things than bad weather. The prisoner was glaring at him. The colleague standing behind him, if you can call him that, did not show any emotion. Here he won due to his composure, an important element that the first one had never managed to acquire. "I see that you haven't lost your humanity, let me go." The prisoner shouted to the first executioner. If it weren't for his colleague, he would have done so. Only a cold-blooded man with a calm expression in a completely soaked raincoat instilled in the former the qualities inherent in him for the job. "Your speeches won't help you," he said uncertainly to the man. The unfortunate man's last hope had died. He had completely lost his spirit, and it was as if life had left his eyes. The second man, taking the prisoner by the elbow, led him to the middle of the cliff. He stopped to the right of the lighthouse, looking towards the ocean. Because of the darkened sky and the darkness that had fallen on the horizon, the end of the ocean was not visible, and in general it seemed as if the darkness had fallen from the sky and spread across the entire surface of the water. I hadn't noticed this beauty before, said the prisoner with tears in his eyes. Consequences are punishment for the actions we have committed, the second executioner said in a sepulchral voice. The first one took out of his coat pocket a book in a black cover, the pages of which were tinted red. You are accused of high treason, he addressed the prisoner and began to read from the book. There is no crime more terrible than betrayal of the motherland, and the one guilty of it should not expect mercy when all his sins are repaid to him doubly. And the traitor will not have his sentence reduced, and he will not live at the expense of the people. His death and the hard labor of his family will atone for the crime committed. The executioner closed the book. He read the sentence as if it were a prayer. This is a mistake, the prisoner kept telling himself. He was sweating and pale, his eyes were darting here and there, he was picking skin off his fingertips. He was a pitiful sight, all wet. He turned his head and his bangs covered his eyes. Suddenly, amidst the sounds of the storm, a loud laugh was heard. The man had completely lost his mind. He stood there and laughed, grimacing. The first executioner was taken aback, but the second did not show it. He had long been accustomed to such antics of prisoners. You are sentenced to death. The first executioner reminded, but the prisoner no longer heard him. Perhaps he had withdrawn into himself, and even if he were beaten with a stick, his mind would not sober up. The prisoner became more pliable. The second executioner managed to bring him to the wall of the lighthouse and stand him upright. The executioners took out their weapons, a Colt with a 10-round magazine. You're wrong, the smiling prisoner shouted. You're wrong, carry out the sentence, said the second executioner, pulling the bolt. I was an executioner too, the man shouted his last words. I'm the same as you. He didn't have time to finish. The shot stifled his words in the bud, and streams of blood began to flow from the small holes in the prisoner's body. The prisoner's eyes rolled back, and he fell to the ground. The first executioner put his pistol back in the holster and turned away. He did not like carrying out the sentence. The second one examined the body and noticed cracks in the wall. He looked at his colleague and didn't show it. Help me. He turned to his comrade. Together they buried the man's body near the lighthouse. It seems that the grave of the murdered man was a meter lower than the grave of another criminal, whom the first executioner executed at the beginning of his career. Having finished with the grave, they took a smoke break and returned to the boat. The entire way back, the first executioner felt his comrade's gaze on him. What happened? He couldn't resist. No. Everything is fine. The first did not sleep for the next 2 nights. He could not fall asleep because he heard the prisoner's laughter in his head. The executioner's wife slept naked. And to distract himself, he ran his hand over her bare shoulders. 2 weeks later, returning home, the first executioner saw a black car on his lawn. He ran to the house. Suddenly something terrible happened. The door of his house opened and a man in black came out onto the lawn. The executioner, what's going on here? Asked the first. I'm an executioner, and I want to know who you are. Following the uninvited guest, more executioners came out and surrounded the owner of the house. The prosecutor approached him and announced for all to hear, you wear this uniform, but you are not an executioner. You are a foreign agent, and the woman you introduced to everyone as your wife confessed that she played her role under your pressure. You are an enemy of the people. This is a mistake. The first shouted the words of the prisoner killed 2 weeks ago. I am the same as you. I have a license, we checked it, it's fake, well forged, but fake, it can't be. The executioner realized the whole picture. His wife came out of the house. Only yesterday she had looked at him with love, but now she was trying not to look him in the eyes, covering her battered face with her palms. She was standing on the lawn with a t-shirt torn at the shoulder, a skirt pulled up, which used to reach her knees, but was now torn at the hip. Her hair was disheveled, makeup was running down her face. Her lips were bloody, and lipstick was visible on her cheeks. We found her in the basement. You should have seen how happy she was to see us, the prosecutor exclaimed. It's not true. We are in love. You brought her to this state, shouted the first executioner, observing the familiar situation from the other side. Do you think so? Let the woman say everything herself. The prosecutor turned to the woman, and she nodded, bending under his gaze. Yes, she said barely audibly. I was rescued from slavery, where I was abused. No. The rejected husband shouted. It's not true. I know it. I know how it works. He screamed at the top of his lungs. You've penetrated so far that we were truly lucky to find you. And do you know what gave you away? You screwed up during the sentencing 2 weeks ago. Our valiant executioner exposed you, and then the first one remembered that night when his hand trembled and he couldn't kill the prisoner, only wounded him and fired the clip into the wall. His comrade noticed this and turned him in to climb the career ladder. Realizing that he had taken the place of that prisoner, the executioner laughed hysterically, and for a few minutes his laughter sounded throughout the entire area. The next story. My name is Alexander. I have already turned 30 years old. Perhaps these notes are the last thing left of me when you are already reading this scribble. I cover the sheets with ink for a reason. It is evening now, which will sooner or later turn into night. And I am not sure that I will be alive in the morning. You understand a whole lot of shit so far, so I will get down to business. It was a long time ago, in the days when 12,000 rubles a month was a good salary, and you could buy so much for 1,000 rubles that you could gorge yourself 5 times over. The year was 2005, I suppose. Like many 13-year-olds suffering from boredom and too much summer vacation, I was shoved off to a summer camp by my parents. Everything was just fine, except for the strange old lady cook, whom we were all afraid of and called a witch behind her back. One of them was white, as if there was no pupil or iris at all, but that was what it seemed at first glance. I think there was something like a cataract, but I don't understand such things. I'm not a doctor, so, that old woman, according to my camp friend Vova, once told them that it was bad to quarrel among themselves, that all sorts of evil spirits feed on it. The strange thing that comes to mind is her knowledge. How could she have found out about this? Yes, Volodya and his roommates really did not get along. But not that much. It never went beyond insults and exchanging a few light blows. The counselors did not bother about such things, typical for such places, so how do you expect to explain that the witch knows about the fights between certain youngsters, of which there were already a dime a dozen that shift? Thank God, if it had ended there, but, alas and alack, it turned out much worse. One morning, which was about halfway through my stay at the children's camp, I woke up to the sound of my father's voice. Get up, Sasha, we need to hurry, my dad kept repeating. You know that feeling when, at the moment of awakening, you somehow expect to wake up at home, but in reality you find yourself in a completely different place. That's exactly what I experienced. It took my brain a few seconds to understand the unusualness of what was happening. The voice of my dad heard at the beginning made me think that I was in our 2-room apartment, but no. In addition to my father, there were other people's ancestors around. They all also woke up their children. Makar's grandparents even came. He had no parents. They died, drank themselves to death, or something else. I didn't know and didn't want to know. Oh, my God, have mercy. Oh, my God, the old woman was babbling under her breath. I, realizing that this smelled of kerosene, if not a nuclear bomb, gathered my things in about 10 minutes, under my father's questions, after which I was led out of the room past a crowd of people in uniform, doctors, police officers, investigators, people dressed in chemical protection suits. Along with this, we could hear loud crying, swearing, hysterical laughter. The nervous center of my body finally processed everything I had seen and heard when we got into the car, where I was again asked about everything, but my mother was already doing this, and I only answered, I don't know, in its various variations. I simply woke up after a night of sleep without any worries, and then lo and behold, a bunch of questions. Mom, maybe you should explain to me what happened. Why did Dad take my things? Why are you taking me away? We can't tell you this now, son. The mother's already worried face turned pale, and she placed her left hand on the one with which my father was changing gears. It was noticeable how her fingers were clenching and unclenching, as if she was kneading the hand she was holding. Despite my desire to understand what had happened, seeing how my mother, who always seemed unperturbed, was nervous, I made the logical decision not to pester either her or my father. The answer to the unsolved mystery was received only several years later, when on the first night of the new year, the 19-year-old me suddenly remembered and asked my already tipsy father, listen, Dad, I just remembered. You remember what happened in the camp, right? That was the last time I went. What other camp? When did you I didn't have time to finish, as my father's face changed to a more gloomy one, and after a minute's pause he began to make half-wheezing sounds, the kind that drunk people make when they are about to say something but either don't dare or are trying to formulate sentences in their heads. There was no one else in the kitchen except the two of us. My mother was asleep, and my cousin and his parents had already gone home. You know, Sasha. I promised myself when you were born that I wouldn't swear in front of the child, but I think it's impossible not to break this rule now. Father sighed heavily. It was a fucking nightmare, son. The camp director called us and told us to come as soon as possible. I almost lost it with my mom. I was painting pictures in my head on the way of what had happened, what made this guy tear us out of our sleep and send us to the camp at full speed. But what happened there? The ancestor hesitated and spoke more quietly. Just indescribable shit. On the second floor, in the room next to yours and the boys', everything was covered in blood, so much so that some of it spilled out into the hallway. The police were just in shock, while the guys in some suits were collecting the remains. It was immediately clear what kind of scraps my parent had in mind. At that moment, it seemed almost impossible to take a sip of the mineral water in my mouth. When I did, I asked just one question: how? We slept peacefully, no one woke up during the night. That's exactly it, and I don't like that, bitch, the father continued. Can you imagine people being slaughtered like cattle in one room, no one hearing anything, and everyone only being found in the morning? No, that's what I'm talking about, Sasha. We haven't taken you anywhere since then because we were afraid. The police were looking for whoever could have done it. They even found him, I think. He was a maniac, a scumbag. He was driving around the whole region. It was not for nothing that we didn't let you in. The father paused and was silent again for a while, and soon spoke again. Sasha, I was a convinced atheist both during the Soviet Union and after it. I turned you to face the exit to the emergency staircase back then, but I managed to see. What was happening there is completely beyond the bounds of anything sane. I understand that a fucked up psychopath can really chop a person into mincemeat, maybe finish off those guys somehow quietly and one by one, but those pieces that were lying in the corridor, they were. He was silent again for a short time. They were. Like a child tears plasticine people to pieces, like bread, like these. This is some kind of wrong bullshit, son. Well, he couldn't do that to them, even if he was the size of Valuev. That's how I got answers. both to the question of what happened and to the unspoken question. I understood why, 5 years later, trying to find Volodya on the social network, contact him in any other way was fruitless. Now I didn't even think about the fact that he could be alive. If everything was covered in blood, and the rest were chopped into mincemeat, then it was unlikely that any boy could have survived. It's been 11 years. Now I'm a 30-year-old lob, living on the other side of the country for 4 years in my apartment. Yes, on a mortgage. I didn't want to be able to change anything. With age, the details of the tragedy described by my father have faded, and my brain has come to believe in the logical version of a crazy Ripper maniac. But not long ago something happened that brought what happened back to the surface of my mind. New tenants moved into the apartment next door. A married couple, a husband, a wife and a child, so small that they still carried him in their arms. He was not allowed to walk. They decided to celebrate the housewarming modestly. They invited me and 40-year-old Irina Ivanovna, she lived with us on the same landing, to their new 2-room apartment. When everyone had gathered, they decided to have a few drinks. Olga, a young mother, did not refuse a drink either, but as soon as everyone had drunk a glass of inexpensive wine, Irina looked at Olga unkindly. "How dare you drink? You're a mother. And one who recently gave birth. Holy shit, why is she like that?" Yeah, I don't argue. Alcohol can hardly be called a product that is not only useful, but also not harmful to the body. However, Olga has already given birth. She doesn't poison the child inside herself. What does she care? I don't even remember what the girl said in such a sarcastic way, but a quarrel was guaranteed. And so, 4 minutes later, torn from the flow of my thoughts, am pestering Irina Ivanovna on one side and the young couple on the other. Quiet, quiet, what are you doing, like animals? Like dogs off their leash. By God, do you like it when people grumble at your party and snap like crazy? Olga said in a tone that was about to turn into a scream. And they want too much for a guest, her husband, Efim, echoed. Enough, enough. Was all I managed to say before the baby in the next room started crying. And you woke up the baby, the young mother muttered and went to calm her son down. It's worth mentioning that they didn't calm him down for long. He kept crying and crying. It seemed like an eternity, but then there was an uneven knock on the door, and then some footsteps. They were ringing in their own way and relatively light. Olga's eyes immediately widened and her mouth opened slightly. "Mom?" The girl said in amazement, looking around at everyone present. I wouldn't confuse her steps with anything else in this life. When a woman of about 50, judging by her voice, cleared her throat behind the door, Efim, with the same 5-kopeck eyes as his life partner, nodded to Alya. Carefully holding the baby with her right hand, the man's wife opened the door without a shadow of a doubt. You know, if something controls our destiny, our lifeline, the chain of events that matter to us, then the only thing I want to do is curse these ephemeral entities. It doesn't matter if it's the stars, God himself, or even some dark matter. I don't care. What happened next was not just undeserved, but something that is impossible to deserve in principle. Olga opened the door, but no one met her on the dark landing. The unexpected guest was not standing at the door or anywhere else on the landing. Everyone present looked at each other warily. Both the steps and the cough had been heard by all of us, but how could this have happened if there was no source of the sound? No one was going up or down the stairs, no one was hiding in the entryway. To my further horror, the answer found itself. Paws covered in some kind of soot, practically blending in with the darkness, reminiscent of human ones, but with black claws and a small undercoat. Suddenly crawled out of the darkness and tore the baby from his mother's arms. The frightened child did not even have time to squeak, as he was thrown onto the entryway floor with such force that the poor thing's head was smeared into a disgusting jelly. And only then did we see why the baby's life was cut short before it had even begun. What had thrown him was definitely not of this world. It was a creature over 2 meters tall, standing on its hind legs. Its body was slightly tilted forward, its legs had 2 joints and ended in some kind of branched hooves. The paws of this otherworldly creature, as I already wrote, were almost indistinguishable from human ones. And the head. It was a ram's skull, the horns of which pointed upwards, and the lower jaw twitched up and down. At the same time, a glow emanated from the head. It was metallic, as if made of dark brass, casting blurred reflections in the light of the apartment that reached it. We stood there in a stupor for about 10 seconds, frozen in an animalistic, inhuman horror, and that bastard didn't even move. It didn't even breathe, it just stood there and stared at us with its empty eye sockets. "You faggot AA." Olga screamed, moving away first and rushing in mad rage with her fists at the heartless killer of her little son. The creature clearly expected such actions from her, so it grabbed the woman by the shoulder with its paw and pushed her onto the railing. I don't even know who was less lucky, Alia or her son, because the girl got her long chestnut hair caught on the very railing where she was pushed, and the creature, without a shadow, opinions, having grabbed the next victim by the torso, with a couple of rough jerks forced the head to break away from the rest of the body, throwing the latter somewhere into the corner. Ethan tried to somehow save the situation, to slam the door, but his plans were not destined to come true. When there was a gap of a couple of dozen centimeters left in the doorway, the monstrous guest intercepted the right hand of the father of the already dead family and tore it out by the root, because of which Ivanovna and I were covered in the man's dark blood. "Run, bitch, run!" I yelled at the mature woman, who was clearly feeling sick, but as soon as I tried to grab the hand of the only person left alive besides me, the door swung open almost immediately, so I, driven by fear for my ass, quickly covered the distance to the nearest window, which I stupidly opened and jumped out. I woke up in the hospital. The story is already too long, so I'll skip all the unnecessary details. In the morning, the neighbors, who saw the carnage left after the chilling events, called an ambulance and the police. The law enforcement officers who arrived found me. I was lying in a dirty puddle mixed with grass under the windows of the apartment. Thank all the gods that it was only the second floor. And I got off with only a bunch of bruises and abrasions and scratches on the branches of a nearby tree while flying. I told the police the truth up until the moment they knocked on the door. I told them about what happened next, like a group of armed idiots broke in and started committing all these atrocities. When asked about their appearance, I didn't say anything intelligible. They were wrapped in scarves, wearing masks, that's all. I don't remember anything. Unfortunately, it didn't help. All the dead, including Lord, the raped Irina with her torn soft spot, had my DNA in large quantities. But what is this? I saw everything with my own eyes, ran away and at least somehow tried to help. If you were me, you would have already resigned yourself to being sent to a mental hospital for life. Honestly, I have too. Food that resembled some kind of soup, therapy and constant supervision became part of my routine until I got into a fight with one of the psychos during one of my dinners. Due to the negligence of the staff, he went crazy and managed to attack me with only a spoon, and I had no choice, a few blows to the head, and here he is lying on the floor, and I am taken to a solitary ward and locked with all conceivable and inconceivable bolts. And then it dawned on me. A childhood friend, Volodya, was sorting things out with his roommates. In the morning they find only scraps. The newlyweds and the neighbor quarrel over all sorts of nonsense. In the morning they again find a horrific picture, and I fought with the violent. Exactly at that moment I decided to write all of the above before sunset and nightfall, to tell everyone who finds these notes, do not fight, feed the demonsti. What a load of crap, muttered investigator Bogdanov under his breath, examining a pile of papers that apparently belonged to Petrenko Alexander Konstantinovich, whose body was found mutilated in the local mental hospital. This is the second case in a month. Apparently, a gang is operating in the city, penetrating into certain areas at night and killing people. A long and tedious investigation with the capture of potential serial killers lies ahead. The next story, an old Ziguli, its engine roaring loudly, pulls into the garage. The car immediately turns off, the front doors open and two guys approach the trunk. Do you think she's still alive? Timur, the passenger, said in an excited voice, "Fuck, we've checked it 100 times. She's dead, lady, she's dead." Jaeger, the owner of the car, answered, gritting his teeth, I knew this party was a bad idea. We could have just stayed home, just had a beer. She dragged us there herself, and we, morons, agreed. In addition, we were dead drunk. Yes, you're right. Lenka herself attacked you with a bottle. Totally nasty, drunk, she remembered old grievances. That's it, stop talking. Better help me. Jaeger takes the dead woman by the hands. Timur, without further ado, grabbed her legs, and the guys dragged the girl's lifeless body to the cellar. It's good to have a cellar in the garage, especially since everything is close to the house. Timur tried to calm down, so he chatted tirelessly. Meanwhile, Jaeger was fiddling with the lock, but the damned key just wouldn't go in. A couple of minutes later, the cellar hatch opened, revealing the darkness of the abyss. That's it, get her here. Jaeger went down a few steps and looked at his comrade. Timur was a little confused that he didn't immediately notice how the corpse had already disappeared. Fuck, it seems like she disappeared, so she disappeared. She just got up and left unnoticed. I don't know. Timur is already on the verge of hysteria. Don't shout. Let's go look for her. The garage complex was quite large, the guys had to split up. Khalif found, in addition to the considerable territory, the autumn night thickened the dark colors. The flashlight on the phone did not illuminate very well, sometimes I had to peer closely. The main problem was dogs. Sometimes they would appear in the garage complex, and not all of them were harmless. Some of them were ready to pounce and feast on human flesh. We tried to solve the dog issue in every possible way. But the dogs kept attacking. We had to take pepper spray or something heavier to defend ourselves. Their barking echoed throughout the complex. Igor is a timid guy, he flinched at every rustle. All sorts of bad thoughts crept into his head. What if Lena was still alive? And while the guys weren't paying attention to her, she ran away, or she became a walking dead person. Maybe even an evil spirit, now playing with them like a cat with mice. He never really liked going to parties, but Timur insisted. Why not, if he had a best friend nearby who would always protect him if trouble came? But neither of them expected this kind of trouble. Lenka is their mutual friend, always there for them. Because they are from the same yard. She herself admitted that she likes the company of Timur and Igor more than spending time with other girls. Lena is a very strange girl. She looks completely normal, and at first she doesn't give anything away, but over time, when friendly relations become truly friendly, Lena begins to behave differently. She began to be jealous of other people, even men, spinning around like a little dog. She talked non-stop about what true friendship means to her, especially with guys like Timur and Igor. Everything about them, thereby irritating everyone, even those two. All this upset Lena, but she pretended that there was nothing wrong. Resentments accumulated inside. Like garbage, and only the far-fetched friendship kept the girl in high spirits. Alcohol made everything bad come out. At the party, Lena couldn't stand it any longer and started telling what had been building up in her soul. She literally blushed with every sentence, with every bad word about Timur. He was the one who had been hounding her against everyone else the most. Jaeger was trying to settle the situation, defending the poor girl. After everything that had been said,
she suddenly took up a knife and attacked Timur. Attempts to stop her failed time after time, until a short muffled scream and hissing were heard. "I'll take you with me," were Lena's last words, and she fell dead right on Timur. Everyone looked on in horror. Someone wanted to call the police. 10 minutes later, the situation was hushed up. They decided not to call anyone. Just pretend that no murder had occurred. Timur took it upon himself to get rid of the body. Jaeger volunteered to help him. All these events did not leave Jaeger's head, which made his paranoia grow. An inner voice said that there would be no troubles in the future, and everything would go wrong. A terribly familiar female voice came out of nowhere. The guy froze, shaking like an aspen leaf. A chill ran down his sweat-soaked back. Jaeger couldn't believe he was hearing Lena's voice. She herself appeared on the roof of one of the garages, smiling broadly. The girl's bloody face and big, wild eyes in the night resembled the muzzle of a predator. All her facial expressions were unnatural. The girl laughed melodically, jumping from roof to roof like a ballerina, not taking her eyes off Jaeger. "Lena, are you still alive?" Jaeger felt a little relief. As soon as he lowered his eyes and raised them again, the girl had already disappeared. Had it really seemed that way? Jaeger shook his head, squinting hard, and looked around. Lena was nowhere to be found. As if she had disappeared into thin air. "Are you hallucinating from stress already?" the guy asked. Heavy breathing could be heard behind him. Come with me." A friend's shout made Timur run at full speed. A suspicion immediately crept into his head about a pack of dogs or a crowd of drunks who liked to drink in the garage complex in the middle of the night. "Igor, just hold on, I'll be there soon," Timur repeated to himself. He only guessed the exact location of Jaeger, but was afraid that he could be mistaken. Upon arrival at the place, Timur found no one, although he was absolutely sure that he ran in the exact direction. "Fuck, Jaeger, where are you?" Timur raised his voice to the entire garage complex. Something heavy and sticky was thrown at Timur's back, and the boy was unable to stay on his feet. Jaeger was lying dead on him. Someone had done a very good job of skinning him. With one sharp movement, Timur knocked the corpse over and ran. He could no longer stay here. Thoughts of Lena's vengeful spirit came to mind, and he was right about that. Like an angel, the dead girl floated through the air, chasing her killer, leaving her silhouettes behind every turn. Her loud laughter echoed throughout the entire complex. Timur hoped that he would reach it while he still had strength. There was very little left. Where the entrance to the garage complex should have been, there was a dead end. Several garages blocked the guy's path. Timur fell to his knees, tears rolling down his cheeks. "Timur, come with me. Remember what you once said. Our friendship is forever."
The next story. The world is full of various gourmets. The world is full of various dishes. Among them, there is one caste that no one likes: cannibals. Among cannibals, there are also many gourmets, as well as various dishes. I prefer babies. They're soft and fresh meat, not yet spoiled by the environment, aromatic, still full of juice. Yes, eating the flesh of children who have just or recently given birth is a heavenly pleasure. That's just the way I am, a gourmet among cannibals. My food rations are easy enough to get, if you're careful, of course. You have to act quickly and stealthily. Some young mother is distracted for a couple of minutes, you have to react quickly, otherwise you might be left without lunch. I don't eat regular human food, it makes me sick. I have to steal about 3 babies a day. When I get home, I kill them, dismember them, pack them up and diligently put all the meat in the refrigerator. Dogs gnaw the bones. They make quick work of such small stuff. I have tried many times to find like-minded people, but my taste preferences were considered very strange even among my own. Sitting for hours in special forums, many people wrote to me that there is no meat at all in babies, the taste is rather bland. After all, it is logical, a person has just been born, has not yet formed, has not accumulated the necessary elements, is not properly fed. Would you eat a newborn lamb? Of course not. Although I would not be surprised if there is a daredevil who wants to try it. It will be a surprise to me if someone understands the entire wonderful taste of meat of a creature that has just recently been born. You just have to bite off, chew it properly, so that all the taste buds pass through the fibers of the meat, the juice spreads throughout the oral cavity, combines with the sauce and spices, exquisite taste, perfect, nothing compares to this. Maybe I should tell you something from my practice. I have a couple of stories, once you listen to them, your blood will run cold, most likely. This is what they usually say when telling scary stories around a campfire. There is no exact schedule for my hunt. For me, stealing a baby is like going to the store for ordinary people. It happened that after a hard day, I could not fall asleep. No matter how hard I tried, from tea to ASMR, I could not sleep. Night was just falling, when a brilliant idea came to my mind, to take a walk. Then I understood those people who catch aesthetic pleasure on autumn evenings. A light cool breeze, which makes it pleasant to breathe. Freshness and a faint scent of leaves that crunch melodically underfoot. Autumn, it is beautiful. I have never enjoyed a walk before, an unusual experience for me. I am not one of those who particularly like to organize such walks. At least until that moment, I didn't even immediately notice the baby's cry. I was staring at the half-naked trees, forgetting about the real world. When the crying became closer and louder, I came out of my euphoria. I became interested in what delicious baby was crying. I was able to make out the silhouette of a mother under a lonely street lamp. She was sitting on an old bench, trying to calm her child. I watched her from the darkness, examining the baby. He was heavy, about 5 or 7 months old. Not a bad piglet. Adrenaline was boiling inside me. I wanted to tear the baby out of the mother's hands, but I had to act carefully. Without prying eyes, without harming the child himself. Oh, my grief. The girl said, standing up. She headed out of the alley. Time to act. I hid in the shadows, without making any unnecessary noise. There was no one around. That's good. I'm always lucky in hunting. I got closer and closer to her until I touched her thin neck. With deft movements of my hands I twist it, she falls dead. The baby cries loudly. It seems to be whole. I carefully take him in my arms, rocking him. He looks at me with wet eyes, stretches his little hands to me, not even suspecting that he will be cut up and used for meat. First, you need to calm him down. If the pig was afraid of being butchered, the meat will not be very tasty. Try to make him fall asleep, and then you can strangle him. I do the strangulation with a pillow. Only after that can you start butchering. First the head, then the limbs, take out all the entrails. You can leave the heart, lungs and liver. I throw everything else to the stray dogs. I use the meatier pieces for mince. I agree, you can take a little meat from a baby to make a reserve. You will need to take about 5 babies a day from their mothers, but for the sake of tasty meat I will do anything. I'll tell you another story that happened to me recently. In broad daylight, I alarmed almost the entire city with my hunting, and it was funny for me to watch all of this. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, I decided to walk around the mall and buy myself something. I bought myself some clothes, a couple more little things, and headed for the mall exit. While I was shopping, I noticed a few delicious babies. I didn't want to risk it, it was a mole after all. It's good that I have a good memory for faces. I remembered my parents' appearance. But all that faded when I saw him, chubby. Big. About a year old. Looks like a pretty tasty baby. I forgot about others, I only needed him. It happened in a parking lot. Usually it is also quite crowded, but you can catch a moment when there are no strangers watching. Only a miracle could have saved me here. Perhaps someone decided to help me by making it so that there were not so many people in the parking lot. My mother. If I understood correctly, that the lady who looked like a socialite was nearby, but she was so engrossed in a conversation with another lady that she would hardly have noticed if they had tried to steal even her car. I tried not to give myself away, just pretending to pass by. Meanwhile, the ladies had gone somewhere. The child remained in the stroller. Apparently, the unfortunate mother had forgotten about him during the conversation. Her stupidity played into my hands. Human stupidity has no limits. While no one was there, I picked up the baby as quickly and carefully as possible. He didn't even cry, he opened his eyes and smiled, holding out his little hands. He walked away with wide strides. As soon as I left the parking lot, a piercing scream of that mother was heard. It didn't sound like a normal human scream, but rather like a siren. Such a commotion arose, people ran to the source of the noise, like a herd of sheep. There was a good hubbub then. I walked home, despite the considerable distance. At least I wouldn't be discovered that way. They would think that a father with a 1-year-old child was returning home after shopping. Only later did I find out, when I read in the newspaper, that I had stolen a baby from some retired top model. They made quite a fuss. The police looked in on almost everyone, asking about suspicious individuals with a child in their arms. They even stopped by to see me. Did I mention the miracle? Yes, it was a miracle that saved me. Someone from above gave me their blessing. I had fun then. It's still funny to remember. I kept the meat and entrails of that baby for a long time, until my birthday. It was a great holiday dinner, and all for me alone. I can go on and on about my adventures, you'll get tired of listening. I'm a little tired myself, a little hungry. You can consider me the most immoral bastard, even among my colleagues in the shop. I am what I am. I am what I eat. This is how your Lord God created me. I'll tell you a secret, there are still many nasty people like me on earth. They just don't talk about it. And you don't even suspect when you're standing at the ticket office, at the bus stop, riding the bus, that you can sit literally right next to someone like me. Now I'll go and eat after all. The next story, I could barely open my eyes, mentally fighting sleep. To be honest, I didn't really want to get up. I looked at the digital clock, trying to see the time, 5:48, it's almost 10 to 6, and I'm already awake. Why is that? Today is a day off, I don't have to go anywhere, but my body still made me wake up so early. I kind of wanted to sleep, and kind of didn't. I sighed heavily and looked at the window. Or rather, at the small gap between the curtains. It was still pitch dark. It was early December. The snow hadn't fallen properly, and the weather was only pleasant with frost. The frost sat so beautifully on the trees. One tree was so covered that it looked like a cocoon. Or was it just me? I smiled slightly at the thought. It was funny, but this tree looked like a human head. As if an avant-garde artist had decided to paint a portrait of a person, a large, awkward head on a very thin and small neck. Nature is the best artist, and no matter how talented a person is, he cannot surpass the beauty of nature. I felt sleepy. I woke up again with difficulty. I looked at the clock again, 6:24, didn't get enough sleep. Oh, my damn body. I still want to sleep, just get a good night's sleep on my day off, and you're making me get up. Well, no, I'm not getting out of my warm bed. I'll lie there as long as I personally need to, until I myself understand that it's time. I turned my attention to the window again. It seemed to me again, but the tree that was covered with frost, like a cocoon, acquired a human outline. The light from the lanterns was weak, plus the darkness, most likely, it was a play of light and shadow. In addition, my sleepy consciousness was playing tricks. Yes, nature is the best artist. I need to get some more sleep. I don't know how long I lay there, but I couldn't sleep a wink. I was too lazy to look at the clock, obviously not for long. Well, I'll just lie there and look out the window until I get bored. Wait, now I clearly see a human face on that tree. Either angry or offended. An incomprehensible emotion, but clearly negative. Now you can't write it off to the play of light and shadow or drowsiness. It really was a head. Did you get sleep paralysis? No, I can move. Then what is it? The face looks straight at me, as if it knows I'm watching it. I closed my eyes, pretended to sleep. I really was trying to sleep. I tossed and turned, no matter what comfortable position I took, sleep still wouldn't come. A strong wind blew outside the window. So warm that it became hot for a moment. Opening my eyes, I saw that very face standing close to the window, blowing that very warm wind. It looked straight into the crack, noticing that I was no longer sleeping. At one point, the wall crumbled, and an incredibly large hand appeared in the room. Grabbing me, it brought the head to that face's mouth. Instantly I was plunged into a sticky darkness from which there was no escape. The next story. The storm raged against the old mansion like a feral beast, its claws of wind and rain raking the weathered stones. Nestled deep in the woods, the Marrow House had stood for centuries, its history woven with whispered tales of madness, betrayal, and blood. Tonight, the house seemed alive, groaning and creaking under the assault, as if protesting the darkness encroaching within. Evelyn tightened her shawl around her shoulders as she lit a candle in the drawing room. She had come to Marrow House reluctantly, summoned by the will of her estranged uncle, Horace. The letter had been cryptic, urging her to claim her inheritance before it was too late. She had arrived just as the storm broke. The forest path twisting and treacherous, guiding her to the house like a predator leading prey. The interior was a mausoleum of shadows and dust. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every move. Evelyn placed the candle on a table, its flickering light casting eerie shapes that danced across the cracked wallpaper. The will, sealed in an envelope marked with an ornate wax crest, lay unopened beside her. The lawyer who had handed it to her had refused to enter the house, his demeanor as pale as the lightning flashing outside. She broke the seal. The parchment within was brittle, the ink faded but legible. To my dearest Evelyn. By the time you read this, I will have departed this wretched world. The Marrow name, once proud, has been cursed by our deeds. The house. It hungers. You must find the key and end its torment. Do not linger once the task is done. Burn the house and leave, for your life and soul depend on it. Forgive me for what I have burdened you with. You are the last hope. A crash of thunder rattled the windows, and Evelyn's breath caught as the candle sputtered. Her uncle's words were the ravings of a madman, yet unease coiled in her stomach. The house felt aware, its silence not of peace but of watchfulness. Resolving to leave as soon as the storm allowed, she folded the will and placed it back on the table. But something caught her eye. A glint of metal embedded in the fireplace's stonework. She approached cautiously, her pulse quickening. It was a key, ornate and ancient, its surface etched with cryptic symbols. She pulled it free, and as she did, the air in the room grew heavy, oppressive. The portraits seemed to lean forward, their expressions twisting with malevolence. A low, guttural whisper echoed through the room. It wasn't her imagination. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a symphony of despair that chilled her to the bone. Evelyn. Her name slithered through the air like a serpent. She backed away, clutching the key, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows deepened, swallowing the light. The house groaned, a sound that resonated like a monstrous heartbeat. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The only reply was a cold, hollow laugh, driven by both terror and curiosity. Evelyn fled the room and ascended the grand staircase, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The hallway above was a labyrinth of doors, each marked with strange carvings. She tried to make sense of them, but her thoughts were clouded by the growing sense of being watched. One door, larger and more ornate than the rest, drew her like a moth to flame. The key seemed to vibrate in her hand as she approached. The carvings on the door matched those on the key, an intricate language she couldn't comprehend. She hesitated, but the whispering returned, more insistent now. "Open it, Evelyn. Free us." The words filled her head, drowning her reason. Her fingers trembled as she inserted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in a sickly green glow. At its center stood a pedestal, and upon it, a book bound in what appeared to be human skin. The whispers became a cacophony as she approached. The book pulsed, as if alive, its pages fluttering despite the still air. Against her better judgment, Evelyn reached out and opened it. The inked words writhed and shifted, forming sentences before her eyes. "The house feeds. Blood binds. Only sacrifice will sate its hunger." The door slammed shut behind her, and the room plunged into chaos. Shadows peeled from the walls, coalescing into monstrous shapes. Evelyn screamed as the specters surrounded her, their faces twisted masks of agony and rage. "You cannot escape," they intoned. "You must choose, flee and doom the world, or stay and sate the hunger." Evelyn's mind reeled. The book's pages turned on their own, revealing an illustration of a knife and a ritual circle. She realized the symbols matched those etched into the floor around the pedestal. Despair washed over her. Her uncle hadn't been mad, he had been desperate. I can't," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You must," the shadows demanded. One specter, more solid than the others, stepped forward. It bore the face of her uncle, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Forgive me, Evelyn," he said. "It was always meant to be you." He extended his hand, and in it appeared the knife from the illustration. Evelyn shook her head, backing away, but the shadows closed in, leaving her no escape. Her screams echoed through the mansion, rising above the storm. Then there was silence. When the sun rose, the storm had passed, but Marrow House remained dark and still. Its windows reflected nothing, its walls emanating a cold that kept the curious at bay. Evelyn was never seen again, and the mansion's legacy of terror lived on, whispered among those who dared speak its name. And deep within, the house waited, hungering for its next victim. The next story, dream or reality. It all started when I came to visit my grandma and grandpa in the village during the summer holidays. I don't know about the others, but I really enjoyed spending time with them. No worries, no responsibilities, live and enjoy. In the morning you can go fishing with your grandfather, play with the kids during the day, watch my favorite cartoons on the old TV in the evening. The only thing that made me uncomfortable were my dreams. They started last summer, when I came to the village. For the entire 2 months that I was there, I only had nightmares, with the same character. An old granny, with a couple of hairs on her head, all twisted up, with a thick stick on which she always leaned. She was dressed in torn rags. This image haunted me all summer. But with the onset of the day, the dreams were forgotten and I also spent the summer day carefree, but with the onset of night, she again, this summer, everything became much worse. If before I saw dreams somewhere from the side, and simply observed what was happening, then this summer, the dreams were with my participation. Over and over again, the same dream, I sleep on my small bed, the moon is shining in my face through the window, crickets are buzzing outside. And then she appears. First, she stares at me with her white eyes in one window, then she climbs into the other window and starts reaching out with her bony, hairy hands. I can't move from fear, and I can't even scream. Morning comes, I wake up in a cold sweat, check the windows, and I start to let go. That night my dream repeated itself. I was also sleeping in bed, when I saw the eyes in the window again. Strangely, I was aware of myself, I could control myself, I did not scream, because I knew or thought that it was a dream. I knew that now she would climb into the window and I would wake up again, and here it begins. She stretches out her bony, wrinkled hands and grabs my leg. Here I already began to scream. I have never seen this dream so far. She begins to drag me. I cling to everything I can, call for help from my grandmother. Grandfather, no one hears me. My hands are already on the windowsill. My nails are digging into the wood, but this creature is much stronger than a child. She pulled me out and began to drag me through the yard into the garden. Then I heard our door to the house open. Did my grandmother and grandfather really hear me? Suddenly something squealed. It seemed to me that this squeal went around the entire planet several times. From the loud scream I lost consciousness. Through the clouding I saw my grandmother and grandfather running, but it was not them. The face was theirs, but they themselves, they looked like healthy angels who were gradually turning back into people. I woke up in my bed. My grandparents were already bustling about the house. Everything was fine. I got up and went to get my clothes, which were hanging on a chair near the window. I was shaking. There were marks from my nails on the windowsill. I looked at my hands. There were bruises on my nails. It was all very strange to me. All day I wondered. Was it a dream? Or was it all in reality? Grandma called me into the kitchen to eat. At breakfast I started looking at Grandma. It seemed to me that she saw it. I quickly removed my eyes and started eating. When I went outside everything was the same. Grandpa was still making something in the barn. Affectionate cat Felix was enjoying the sun, and there was morning birds singing all around. I went to the place from my dream. There was crushed grass there. It was definitely not a dream. Already in the evening, at dinner, I decided not to sleep all night. More precisely, to pretend that I was sleeping, but in reality just close my eyes. Our lights out was at 10 p.m., the clock beeped every hour, so I decided to tell the time. Somewhere around 2:30, I felt a gaze on me. I understood that now everything was about to begin. I opened my eyes sharply. But instead of that same old woman in the window, in front of me stood my grandmother and grandfather, my grandmother and grandfather. They were not angels, like last time. They were terrible, dark, and horned. Are you trying to deceive us, Maximka? The old woman said in a squeaky voice. You can't fool the old devils, her grandfather added. They both burst out laughing. I was terribly scared. I didn't know what to do in this situation. In the window I saw those same white eyes. It was the old woman who always wanted to take me away. She broke the window and attacked the old woman, started biting her neck. My grandfather, or rather the devil, with my grandfather's face, started pushing the old woman away from his beloved, but his attempts were countable. Having finished with the grandmother, the old woman attacked the grandfather. Having dealt with them, she took me by the legs and dragged me towards the garden. Carefully laying me on the grass, she fixed my hair and flew away. I didn't know what to do. What was all this? Who are my grandfather and grandmother? Who is this old woman? Without strength, I just burst into tears and sat like that until dawn. Rumors fly fast. Especially if they involve a love triangle, gender, drug use, and the murder of a family member. All of this is commonplace, it happens everywhere, but has anyone ever heard of African shamans performing voodoo rituals in a cemetery in the Russian hinterland? It's absurd, of course, but such a crazy rumor spread like hotcakes around our village. Who would have thought that such a thing was possible? Inexplicable, but true. Has anyone seen them in real life? Do they really exist? The village eavesdropping site on one well-known social network is full of various videos of eyewitnesses from the cemetery, where those same shamans from Africa are allegedly captured. Most of it is outright nonsense and staged. But there are a couple of videos that at least somehow pull off evidence. It would not be difficult to hire a few blacks in the city, bring them to the village, dress them up as aborigines and let them into the cemetery in the middle of the night, but still, why not? Suddenly, in fact, aborigines live in the cemetery, appearing out of nowhere. When they first appeared, or rather, rumors about the natives, they whispered that the dead began to walk. At night they rose from their graves and wandered around the cemetery, some even went out into the village. Many videos and photos with the participation of walking corpses can be found in the eavesdropping of our village. There are also quite a variety of productions. But you can find something interesting. Living witnesses are present, but who will believe the elderly? And so, for the sake of interest, I decided to find out a little about what is happening in the cemetery of our village. Taking a couple of friends, Oleg and Maxim, we headed to our mystical place in the evening. Just in case, I took a hatchet with me, in case I had to defend myself. Oleg also took a weapon with him, a small homemade club with nails. Maxim did not take anything, relying on us. He is weak, it is unlikely that he will cope, but he knows how to hide well. If something terrible happens, and Oleg and I have to fall in battle, Maxim will definitely survive, and then tell everyone about us. Whether they will believe it or not, it is unknown, at least they will be interested in the disappearance of our persons. Once at the cemetery, we found a secluded place to wait for the night. It was getting dark, the darkness was gradually enveloping us, and the coolness made us pretend to be wild aborigines. It's all nothing, scientific interest is above all. The moon was high in the night sky, brightly illuminating the ominous cemetery. It had been a long time since we had sent here, and we had not seen anything like this. We do not intend to give up yet. Until the morning comes, we will still guard the cemetery. Our expectations were eventually justified. We heard awkward singing in an incomprehensible language and loud stomping. As if someone had really decided to hold a ritual. The three of us headed towards the source of the noise. Oleg and I took out the weapon. We tried not to make unnecessary sounds, it was scary after all. Whoever it was, they were clearly crazy people if they decided to hang out in a cemetery. Ahead of us appeared the glimmer of a fire, and shadows moving in an incomprehensible dance. Coming a little closer, the following scene opened up before us. Several black aborigines were spinning around the fire, singing something in their language. Next to them stood several living dead, some of them were still fresh, seemed like ordinary people, the rest were rotting, with maggots inside. But they stood steadfastly and watched the savages. We became witnesses to the confirmation of the tale about our cemetery, but what now? The only thing left to do was to quietly leave. Just as we were about to turn back, Maxim suddenly gave away our location. It was a bad idea to take him, he knows how to hide well, physically he is in bad shape, he couldn't hold back when they were turning in single file and rolled right up to the fire. The natives noticed Max and immediately grabbed their spears, guys. Help! Was the last thing we heard before Maxim was stabbed. Under the dying cries of a friend, Oleg and I had to abandon each other. Fear overcame courage. The two of us headed out of the cemetery while those savages were shouting something. If only everything were so easy. A chase immediately began after us. And the worst thing is that those walking zombies were chasing us. Picking up the pace, we rushed forward, and only forward. Literally jumping over graves, just to break away from the undead pursuers. Oleg fell behind me. Out of nowhere, one of the living dead jumped on him. He tried to fight, but his strength was not equal. I continued to run, enduring the pain in my lungs, saving my skin above all else. Then they caught me, completely exhausted, tripped over something and fell, right at the feet of the dead. With their slimy, hard hands they grabbed me and dragged me back to the savages. I tried to resist, too weak for such a thing. I found myself again near the fire. The savages surrounded me, examining and feeling me. The corpses of my friends lay near the fire, their bellies ripped open, all their entrails burning in the fire. Their lifeless eyes looked at me, their heads were impaled on spears, their blood trickled in thin streams onto clay bowls. Was I going to die in a similar way? The next story. The bus doors closed behind me with difficulty. An empty bus stop, except for two bearded men, already blue from drinking alcohol. A light cold wind walked along the street, dispersing the smell of rain. The night darkness had long since enveloped everything around. Here it is, autumn. The real thing. To be honest, I like this time of year, when it is damp and cold. There is something special about it. So to speak, magical and melancholic. And now, returning home from a friend, I will enjoy a short walk. Especially since I need to air out the alcohol. We drank too much, and I am not much different from those alcoholics sitting near the bus stop. If only an adequate behavior and at least some stability on my feet. After standing there for a minute, I finally moved. There was a strange lightness in my head, which made it seem like everything around me was wrong, not real. I need to drink less, degradation is in full swing. With a flying gait, humming to myself, I strolled along the way home, looking around. From time to time I glanced at the sky, where the stars and the moon were shining. The silence of the courtyards, the rare flashes of car headlights. Yes, there is beauty in this. And only when you are drunk do you encounter such beauty. Everything would be fine. I was walking, when suddenly I heard a voice. Quiet, weak. Most likely an old woman's. I looked around, listened. The voice was coming from the direction of the garbage bins. I noticed some scurrying there. Someone, help, what happened? I asked casually, oh, grandson, I fell. Now I can't get up. Help me, I beg you. Something seemed strange to me in all this. Especially the way the old lady spoke. Somehow guttural, or something, and while sitting in a barrel. But I didn't want to pay attention, because in old age this happens. So without further hesitation I went to help the grandmother. She, in turn, stretched out her hands. I tried to get a better look at her, but apart from an old shabby coat and dirty pants I didn't see anything. Her face was so well hidden under the scarf, as if the darkness had swallowed her. Oh, thank you, grandson. Thank you, said the old woman. No, not for. I didn't have time to finish, as her palm squeezed my forearm. So tightly that I felt how the granny was squeezing my bones. Hey, granny, what's wrong? Thank you, grandson, thank you, she repeated, her voice now distorted. I tried to break free, but to no avail. The old hag had me in her grasp. Let me go. I screamed, kicking her away, but she didn't care. then I had to act radically. With all my strength, I pushed the old woman towards the trash can. Then I somehow fought her off, hitting her against the metal surface. Her grip weakened, the hag let go of me and fell flat, like a puppet. At that moment, the hood fell back, revealing her head. And, oh God! It was not a person. An oval head with an elongated face, distorting every second, like frames, with an expression of emotions, sometimes suffering, sometimes sadness, sometimes anger. After a while, the creature stood up, revealing all of itself. A long, skinny gray body, covered in mucus, with disproportionately small limbs. Hands with long nails bent at the elbows, and instead of feet there was something like hooves. This thing was walking towards me with a crooked gait. I couldn't stand and fell backwards on the wet asphalt, backed up and leaned my back against the fence. My breathing was ragged, sweat was streaming down my forehead. With great effort, I managed to get up and run away, but it was no use. I heard the clatter of hooves behind me. I turned my head half a turn and saw this monster rushing after me at a decent speed of a car, swaying from side to side and waving its arms like wings. I couldn't hold back a scream. My legs carried me home on their own. I didn't care where I was going, I was just rushing, but then an unexpected surprise awaited me. When I ran out to the roadway, the only obstacle to my house, I stopped for a moment and looked around. And then I noticed two silhouettes standing on the other side of the road. They were hiding in the darkness, out of reach of the streetlights. They were just standing and looking at something. I was already glad that they were people. I started shouting something unintelligible at them and waving my arms, but it was a bad decision. As you probably understood, those two silhouettes were clearly not people. Personally, I realized this late, only when those things came into the light. Jumping back and almost falling, I ran in the other direction. Those monsters blocked my way home. Now I don't know where to go. I just run, just to get away from those creatures. Their slapping steps were heard behind me. They were getting closer and closer to me. My strength was leaving me, I could no longer run. Is this the end? I stopped for a moment near some residential building to catch my breath. The creatures had fallen behind, so I had time. While I was enjoying a moment of peace, I noticed a basement. In the darkness I saw that the door was slightly open. It seemed that one of the residents forgot to close it. I was damn lucky. I ran there headlong. When I found myself in the darkness of the basement, I abruptly closed the door and pressed my back against it. My lungs were burning, and my legs could no longer stand, and I fell on my butt again. There was a commotion behind the door. The creatures crowded around the door, but had no idea what to do. They cackled, mooed, thus communicating with each other. I had to hold my breath, and in general try not to make sounds until they left. After several long minutes, they dispersed. I felt like I was about to lose consciousness. My lungs were burning, my head was buzzing. I tried to hold on until the last minute, but I still sank into a dream world. I have no idea how long I slept like that. My body was aching and it was very cold. Unpleasant feelings after those events. I didn't even immediately realize that I was holed up in the basement. I cautiously left the shelter. The bright light of the sun hit my eyes. Was it all over? I couldn't believe that I had saved them from those terrible monsters. It was daytime outside, people were going about their business, cars were driving back and forth. I, dazed after the night, headed toward home. Of course, I couldn't escape the surprised looks and whispers of passers-by. My appearance clearly indicated that I had escaped from a yellow house. But I didn't care then. The most important thing was to get home, it could all be attributed to alcohol intoxication, but no way. That day I was not so drunk as to see devils in the snuff box. This incident could have been forgotten if I had not met them again on a winter evening when I went to the store for bread. After our first meeting, there were many more of them. And now it seems to me that this time I will not be lucky. The next story, who among us hasn't collected? I'm sure that everyone has collected bottle caps, chips or cards at least once. As a child, I loved collecting various stickers. I remember I even had a special album where I collected almost 1,000 different stickers over 5 years. It's a pity that I later lost it somewhere. However, several stickers still remain. They hung on the door to my room. There were a couple of stickers from cartoons and chocolate bars on it. The hockey player sticker stood out in particular. It has a rich history. It was given to me by one of my classmates in elementary school. At school, I was good friends with all the kids, but one day I got into a fight with 2 boys who were a year older than me. One day after school, they waited for me around the corner to beat me up. Luckily, my classmate Lenya was passing by. He stood up for me. Lenya had been playing hockey since childhood and rarely passed by someone else's misfortune. So he helped me out, after which we became friends. Later, it was Lenya who gave me this hockey player sticker. I remember that I gave him a return gift. I molded a puck with a stick out of plasticine. Now I'm 26, so I graduated from school almost 10 years ago. We stopped communicating with Lenya after the 5th grade. He transferred to a gymnasium then. Nevertheless, I have pleasant memories. I've long since gotten used to the stickers, so I rarely pay attention to them. Except when I want to feel nostalgic sometimes. Yes, I live alone in an apartment that I inherited from my parents. My father died a few years ago, and my mother moved into a 1-room apartment. A 2-room apartment is more important to you, son, my mother told me. When you get married and have a baby, a 2nd room won't be superfluous. True, I haven't gotten around to getting married yet. There are enough problems without it, but that's not the point. One evening I came home from work. It had been a tough day. The labor inspectorate was supposed to come to our work soon, so everyone was on edge, preparing for the inspection. Not only was I delayed an hour at work, but the bus on the way home broke down. The minibus with my number runs every half hour, so I had to stay another 30 minutes. On top of that, no one had canceled the lines at the grocery store. In short, I came home tired. Tired, as if I'd been carrying sacks of bricks all day. I didn't even want to eat, only to rest. I kicked off my shoes from the doorway and collapsed on the bed. The pleasant moments of enjoyment were interrupted by some vague feeling. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt somehow uncomfortable. The main thing is that I can't understand what's wrong. The temperature in the apartment is normal, there's no draft, the neighbors aren't making noise. You know, that feeling as if you're in a place you don't like. I had that once, as a child, when my mother took me to visit a friend. I didn't like it there at all. The apartment was somehow gray, the air was stuffy, the interior of the rooms was somehow dreary and depressing. My apartment wasn't even close to my mother's friend's apartment, but something was clearly wrong here. I glanced at the door involuntarily. At first I didn't notice anything unusual, a couple of scratches, last year's calendar, peeling paint and stickers in places. That's when I noticed the hockey player sticker. The athlete's eyes had turned completely black. There were 2 dark circles. I shuddered in surprise, but tried to find a reasonable explanation for this. Perhaps this defect had appeared a long time ago. But I just hadn't paid attention to it. Probably the paint had worn off over time, and I hadn't even noticed it. Everything would be fine, But why did these black circles look like they were burned out? I racked my brains for a few minutes, but couldn't come up with anything. I was brought out of my thoughts by a phone call. Another bank was calling again, offering a favorable loan. I put my mobile phone aside and looked at my watch. It was getting on for the night. I decided not to bother my head with guesses about the sticker and began to get ready for bed. The feeling of discomfort had diminished, but I couldn't get a good night's sleep that night. The room was stuffy, even though I had opened the window. The nasty mosquitoes seemed to have decided to finish me off on someone's tip. Their squeaks irritated me all night. It's too bad I forgot to buy poison. A series of new problems awaited me at work, and I had to shove my dissatisfaction somewhere far away. It's hard for everyone right now, and pouring oil on the fire with a bad mood is definitely not worth it. Somehow I held out until the end of the day. Tomorrow is the last working day of the week, and that's the only thing that made me happy. I got home surprisingly quickly. Having quickly prepared an omelet with sausage, I quickly ate dinner and spent the rest of the evening watching TV. After tossing and turning a bit, I finally fell asleep when night fell. I dreamed of hockey. I watched with admiration how skillfully the hockey players moved on the ice. They skillfully hit the puck with their sticks, which flew first to one corner, then to the other. 3 periods passed, and the hockey match ended. The spectators from the stands began to applaud the athletes for their brilliant play. I stood up from my seat and also clapped, watching the hockey players. The blue team won, but for some reason I noticed the red team's goalie. The player took off his helmet, and my whole body shuddered. The athlete's eyes were surrounded by an incomprehensible black veil. There were a lot of spectators in the arena, but I was sure that this hockey player was looking at me. He stood calmly in one place and glared at me. I don't know how long this staring game lasted, but suddenly I heard an incomprehensible whisper. Yes, yes, in a noisy arena among dozens of people in an endless stream of noise and shouts, I heard someone whisper. Probably, this quiet voice was in my head, because next to me there were 4 guys who did not pay any attention to me at all and watched what was happening on the ice. I tried to make out at least something from the words I heard, but I understood nothing. Some kind of gibberish. Eventually, the whisper seemed to cut me from the inside, and my head began to hurt. I grabbed the handles and fell to my knees, after which I suddenly woke up in my bed. The voice was gone, and there was silence in the room. Only the rarely passing cars could be heard outside the window. I sighed heavily and stared at the ceiling. It was the second night I couldn't sleep. The dream made me remember the hockey player sticker again. I got out of bed and went to the door, turning on the light. The sticker had a hockey player on it, exactly like the one in my dream. The same 2 black circles instead of eyes. I tore the sticker off, then tore it into several pieces and threw it in the trash. Apparently, I think too much about unnecessary things, that's why I have nightmares. However, one strange thing couldn't be denied: dark circles remained on the door even after I tore off the sticker. What kind of mysticism is this? The circles didn't look like paint. They looked more like burning. The problem was that I personally hadn't done anything like that to the door. I tried to find an explanation for this yesterday. When I first noticed the strangeness with the sticker, I felt uneasy. I don't believe in all these spirits, ghosts and other nonsense, but the fact of the strange circles on the door couldn't be denied. In the end, I made myself some chamomile tea and went to bed closer to 4 a.m. I woke up a couple of hours later and was even late for work because of my bad sleep. Fortunately, my boss didn't notice, so I managed to avoid unnecessary stress. The details of the working day can be omitted, because the worst began the following night. I planned to at least sleep off and regain my strength on the weekend, but this was not destined to happen. I went to bed early and even slept peacefully for several hours, but an incomprehensible rustling made me wake up. I don't even know whether it's a gift or a curse to wake up from every sound. The first thing I did was look at my watch, 2:47. Then I looked at the window and was horrified. There was a man standing opposite my bed. However, even then I had doubts that it was really a man. Then who or what was it? How did a stranger get into my apartment? The moonlight and street lighting helped me to see the night visitor a little. It looked like a man in hockey gear. His face was hidden behind a hockey goalie mask. For a second I thought I was in a bad dream again. I pinched myself. It hurt, but the stranger hadn't disappeared. I closed my eyes and opened them again. The result was the same as before, although the night visitor had come one step closer to me. At this point I couldn't stand it any longer and, jumping up on my bed half a meter, flew out of my room like a bullet. In a few moments I reached the bathroom and locked the door. Now I faced another problem. I found myself in pitch darkness. I was ready to burst into tears from such a hopeless situation, but suddenly I remembered about the flashlight. The flashlight. A week ago I was cleaning the siphon in the bathroom and used a flashlight. I left it on the washing machine and couldn't get it into the room and put it back in its place in the closet. I immediately thanked myself for my laziness and reached for the flashlight by touch. Let there be light, I thought joyfully, pressing the button to turn on the flashlight. Now I prayed that the battery wouldn't die and leave me in the dark. I pointed the flashlight at the door and felt my heart pounding anxiously. It felt like I'd run several kilometers without a break. However, the worst was yet to come. I watched in horror as the lock on the door began to turn counterclockwise. It became clear that the night visitor had decided to get me. I grabbed the handle and the lock with all my might to keep the stranger out of the bathroom. I was also holding the flashlight. The worst thing for me was to be left alone in the complete darkness with this hockey player. I don't know how long this battle for the bathtub lasted, but at one point the door handle fell off. Refusing to participate in this fight with the otherworldly. For me, this did not go without consequences, since I leaned against the door and grabbed onto this damn handle. Because it came off, I flew backwards, hitting the back of my head on the bathtub. Before I passed out, I noticed how the door finally opened. I woke up in the morning, lying in an unnatural position on cold tiles in a small pool of blood. I grabbed the back of my head and cried out in pain. I hit myself pretty hard, but most of all I was glad that I was alive at all. I carefully looked out from behind the door. There was no one in the apartment, and the bright rays of the sun and the morning time acted as a guarantee of safety for me. I decided to treat the wound and went out into the corridor, heading for the first aid kit. I noticed small indentations and cuts on the linoleum. It felt as if they were left there by someone who wore skates. At least now I had no doubt that the night visitor was real. However, who he was and what he wanted remained a mystery. I took a short break and tried to think it all over and put the facts together. I realized that it all started with the sticker. Probably, the whole point is not in it, but in the hockey player who is depicted on it. Now I realize that I tore it off at the wrong time. Fortunately, I did not take the trash out into the street, because there was almost none. It was not easy to collect the sticker piece by piece, but I still managed. At least then I learned the hockey player's name. Let's call him Alexander. It's great that we live in the digital age, and if not everything, then a lot can be found on the internet. So I was able to quickly collect information about the hockey player from the sticker. His sports career turned out to be eventful. He played hockey since childhood, and at 20 he was already participating in international competitions. He had to play with different countries, Finland, Canada, Switzerland and Japan. Victories were not always, but Alexander did not lose heart, and each game gave him practical experience. However, in one of the matches he received a serious truth, which put an end to his further participation in hockey games. What shocked me more was that one of the sources reported that he had died a week ago. Although the reason was not specified, this puzzled me. Alexander was only 41 years old. At that age the whole life is ahead of him. At least the death of the hockey player explained the events that had happened a few days earlier. Now I had no doubt that the night visitor was Alexander, or rather his ghost. Whether you like it or not, after this it will be difficult not to believe in otherworldly forces. I also guessed that the sticker and the black circles on it were some kind of harbinger before all this fuss. I couldn't figure out what exactly the ghost wanted from me. I decided to dig deeper and found Alexander's page on social networks. An unremarkable account. There are a few photos, including in hockey gear. A couple of reposts from sports communities, and under the very last post about hockey there were several comments like, "May the earth rest in peace, my friend," and "Sleep well, Sonia." There are no former athletes. At least it became clear that the news about the hockey player's death was true, and not someone's evil joke or fake. Finally, I checked Alexander's friends list. I even found his mother there. I thought she could help me somehow, so I wrote to her. I introduced myself as Alexander's friend and decided to ask a little about him. Then details emerged that I didn't know. It turns out that Alexander was indeed a successful hockey player, as I had read earlier. However, then a black streak in his life seemed to decide to strangle the man. A sports injury was the starting point. After it, other health problems appeared in life, but the final verdict was oncology. Yes, this also happens. A person has been working on his body all his life, taking care of his health, and fate gives him such a terrible verdict. A topic that one can think about forever. According to the woman, before his death, Alexander was carried away in this direction, and through terrible pain he wrote several dozen pages of his thoughts on this issue. However, the man was most infuriated by something else, namely, that people only see the tip of the iceberg called success. After the injury, both the coaches and the judges, as well as his teammates, forgot about him rather quickly. The cruel reality is that today you are in the spotlight, your photo and name are on collectible stickers, and tomorrow you are used material. Before the hockey player's death, no one visited or cared about his condition, and only his mother became the person who saw him off to the end, giving him the last rays of kindness and love. Only later did the woman receive condolences from several people, and after the funeral, Alexander received sympathetic comments on social networks from 3 of his most loyal friends. I felt very sorry for Alexander and his mother after this story. I was ready to sink into depression myself from such injustice, but the woman asked me to go to church and light a candle for the peace of her son. "I think my Sashenka just can't calm down," the hockey player's mother explained. "We need to light a candle for him and remember something good about him, then he'll leave this world with a calm soul." I initially thought about telling the woman about the strange events in my life over the past few days, but I decided against it. I didn't want to seem crazy, and I didn't want to just push a sore spot. I'm not particularly religious, but I still decided to follow the woman's advice. I went to church, lit a candle for the hockey player, and mentally thanked him for the pleasant connection with the past. I was not eager to spend another night at home, so I decided to rent a room in an inexpensive hotel. Closer to 11 p.m., I checked into the room and took a shower. I expected new surprises that night, but to my surprise, everything went as smoothly as possible. I did not hear strange noises, the ghost did not come to me again, the stuffiness and insects did not prevent me from sleeping. I stayed in the room until 12 noon, when the maid came and asked me to check out. I reluctantly headed home. When I entered the apartment, I immediately noticed the linoleum. The skate marks were gone, as if they had never been there. The door handle was also as good as new, as if I had never opened it. Miracles, and nothing more. I walked into the kitchen and was startled to see a note on the table. It read, "Thank you for praying for me. Forgive me for persecuting you. I will not bother you again. Goodbye. Sincerely, Alexander." I crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash. I felt calm, but I decided to get rid of the note to forget the whole nightmare of the previous days. Finally, I entered the room and saw that only cracked paint remained in place of the sticker, and the dark circles disappeared. Exhaling, I lay down on the sofa, trying not to think about anything. About an hour after returning home, I went about my business and prepared for the next day's work. I felt comfortable in my own apartment again, and I could return to my normal rhythm of life. Although I still had some concerns, they turned out to be in vain. The night passed calmly and without incident. The next one too, a month later. I almost didn't remember the night meeting with the hockey player, but I learned a small lesson from this story. Now I try to be more attentive to other people's problems, because you never know how dire the consequences of indifference to other people's troubles can be. After all, already in childhood, Lenya showed and proved to me that it is worth being kinder and more attentive to people. Now I will definitely not forget this, and I advise others to remember such simple truths. The next story: the sea was restless that night, churning and frothing under a swollen, bruised sky. The fishing village of Black Harbor crouched against the cliffs like a guilty secret, its crooked shacks huddled together as if bracing against some unseen storm. The villagers whispered of ill omens, of strange tides and darker things stirring beneath the waves, but no one dared to speak too loudly. Not here, where the sea had its own ears. It began with the bells. High atop the jagged spire of Widow's Rock stood an ancient bell tower, long abandoned and battered by centuries of salt and wind. The bell itself, massive and blackened, had not rung in living memory. But tonight, it tolled. A deep, mournful sound that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of the earth. The villagers froze where they stood, eyes wide and hands clutching whatever tokens of protection they believed might help them. The sound was wrong, too low, too resonant, as though it came not from the bell but from the depths of the sea itself. Jonas Merrill, the village's oldest fisherman, was the first to speak. "It's calling them," he muttered, his voice trembling. "The deep ones. They're coming." The younger men laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease that clung to them like the ever-present mist. But Jonas wasn't laughing. He had seen too much in his years, strange shapes moving beneath the waves. Ships swallowed whole without a trace, and the marks left on the beach when the tide receded too far. "We need to go," he said, his voice rising in desperation. "Leave the village. Leave now." But no one moved. They couldn't, not when the sound of the bell held them rooted in place, their hearts pounding in rhythm with its mournful tolling. It was then that the sea began to rise. The tide came in unnaturally fast, not in waves but as a single, smooth swell that swallowed the shoreline and lapped hungrily at the village's edge. The water was black, not the deep blue or gray of normal tides, but a thick, oily black that seemed to drink in the light. And with it came the shapes. At first, they were only shadows beneath the surface, indistinct and shifting. But as the water surged higher, they became clearer. Twisted, otherworldly forms that defied comprehension, limbs that bent in impossible ways, eyes that glowed faintly like dying embers, and mouths filled with rows of jagged teeth. The villagers screamed and fled, but there was nowhere to go. The sea was all around them now, cutting off their escape and drawing closer with each passing second. In the chaos, young Eliza Dane clung to her father, her wide eyes fixed on the towering figure that had emerged from the waves. It stood twice as tall as a man, its body a grotesque fusion of scaled flesh and chitinous armor. Its eyes burned with an ancient intelligence, and when it opened its mouth, the sound that came forth was not a roar but a low, resonant hum that seemed to speak directly to the soul. "It's the caller," Jonas whispered, falling to his knees. "The harbinger of the end." The caller raised one clawed hand, and the bell atop Widow's Rock tolled again. This time, the sound was deafening, reverberating through the village and sending shockwaves through the water. The villagers who had tried to flee were caught mid-step, their bodies seizing as if held by invisible chains. One by one, they began to walk toward the sea, their faces blank and their movements mechanical. "Father, no." Eliza cried as her father's grip loosened and he stepped away from her. She tried to hold him back, but it was like trying to stop the tide itself. He waded into the water, joining the others as they marched toward the caller and disappeared beneath the waves. Eliza ran to Jonas, who was still kneeling in the mud, his face pale and his eyes distant. "What do we do?" she pleaded. "How do we stop it?" Jonas shook his head slowly. "You don't stop it, child. You survive it, if you can." But Eliza refused to give up. She grabbed a lantern and began to climb Widow's Rock, the bells tolling growing louder with each step. The air grew colder, and the wind howled around her, but she pressed on, driven by a desperate determination. When she reached the top, she found the bell swinging wildly, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. Beneath it, carved into the stone, was a series of runes that seemed to pulse with their own light. The runes, Jonas had said once, years ago, when telling her the village's old legends. They're what hold it back. If they're broken. Eliza didn't know what she was doing, but she grabbed a loose rock and began to hammer at the runes. The stone resisted her blows at first, but then cracks began to form. As the first rune shattered, the bell stopped mid-swing. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound, a void that seemed to suck the air from her lungs. The caller let out a deafening screech, its form convulsing as the sea began to churn violently. The villagers who had been walking into the water stopped and fell to their knees, their blank expressions giving way to confusion and terror. The shapes beneath the waves writhed and twisted, and for a moment, it seemed as though the sea itself might tear apart. Then, with a final, ear-splitting crack, the last rune shattered. The caller let out one last, echoing cry before its form dissolved into the churning water. The sea began to recede, pulling back toward the horizon and taking the blackness with it. The oily residue that had coated the village was gone, leaving only the faint smell of salt and decay. Eliza collapsed beside the broken bell, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Below her, the villagers were beginning to gather, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Jonas was among them, his eyes filled with tears as he looked up at her. "You did it," he said softly. "You sent it back." But as Eliza looked out at the now calm sea, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The caller had been banished, but the bell tower still stood, and the runes had been broken. The village of Black Harbor might have earned a reprieve, but the sea never truly forgave. And somewhere, deep beneath the waves, the deep ones waited, patient and eternal, for the bell to toll once more. The next story, in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there was a stretch of land known as Devil's Hollow, a place so steeped in shadow and folklore that even the most hardened travelers avoided it. For centuries, stories had circulated about strange lights, whispered voices, and people who ventured into the hollow never to return. But for Jacob Harlow, a struggling journalist desperate for a breakthrough story, Devil's Hollow was an opportunity too enticing to pass up. Jacob arrived in the small town of Greystone on the edge of the hollow just before dusk. The town was little more than a cluster of weathered houses and a single diner, where the locals eyed him warily as he entered. The air inside was thick with the smell of grease and coffee, and the conversations hushed as he approached the counter. "You're not from around here," the waitress said, her tone somewhere between curious and suspicious. Her name tag read Maggie, and her eyes flicked to the camera slung around Jacob's neck. "No, ma'am," Jacob replied, forcing a smile. "I'm a journalist. Thought I'd write about Devil's Hollow." The room fell silent. One of the older men in the corner spat into a tin can and muttered, "You'll want to rethink that." Maggie's expression hardened. "No one goes into the hollow and comes back the same." "If they come back at all," Jacob chuckled nervously. "Well, I'll just be taking a look around. Maybe snap a few pictures, talk to some folks about the local legends." The old man's gravelly voice cut through the room. "Legends ain't the word for it, boy. You're messin' with things older than you can imagine." Undeterred, Jacob thanked them for their concern, paid for his coffee, and headed out. He could feel their eyes on his back as he loaded his gear into his car and set off toward the hollow. The road to Devil's Hollow was narrow and winding, hemmed in by towering trees that seemed to close in the further he drove. By the time he reached the entrance, marked only by a rusted sign half hidden by vines, the last light of day was fading, and an unnatural quiet had settled over the forest. Jacob parked his car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot startling in the stillness. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay. He shouldered his backpack, checked his flashlight, and set off down the overgrown trail. As he ventured deeper, the world seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The sounds of the forest, chirping insects, rustling leaves, faded into an oppressive silence. Jacob's footsteps felt deafeningly loud, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. About a mile in, he came across the first strange sight, a circle of stones, each etched with symbols he didn't recognize. Surrounding a tree whose bark was blackened as if it had been burned. He snapped a few photos, but as he bent to examine the symbols, a faint sound caught his attention. It was a whisper, so soft he almost thought he'd imagined it. He turned, shining his flashlight into the woods, but saw nothing. "Hello." He called out, his voice trembling slightly. The whisper came again, this time clearer. It wasn't a word, but a sound, a low, mournful sigh that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Jacob's heart pounded as he pressed on, the trail growing more indistinct with every step. The air grew colder, and a dense fog began to roll in, twisting around the trees and clinging to his skin. He glanced at his GPS, only to find the screen blank. His phone, too, was dead, though he'd charged it fully before leaving the car. The fog thickened, and soon Jacob could barely see a few feet ahead. He stumbled on a root and fell, his flashlight skittering away. As he scrambled to retrieve it, he heard something behind him, a soft, wet sound, like footsteps in the mud. He froze, his hand closing around the flashlight. Slowly, he turned it on and swept the beam around. The fog parted briefly, revealing a figure standing just at the edge of the light. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally elongated, and its face. Jacob couldn't describe the face. His mind recoiled from the sight of it, as though it was something not meant to be seen. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, a weight pressing down on his chest. Jacob stumbled to his feet and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly as he plunged deeper into the forest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the air seemed to hum with a strange energy. Shapes moved in the fog, glimpses of things that shouldn't exist, their forms flickering and twisting like shadows cast by an unseen fire. He burst into a clearing and stopped, his breath ragged. In the center of the clearing was a cabin, its wooden walls warped and blackened. The door hung open, and a faint light flickered within. Jacob hesitated. But the sound of footsteps behind him left him no choice. He ran inside, slamming the door shut behind him. The interior of the cabin was worse than the forest. The walls were covered in symbols, scratched deep into the wood, and the air was heavy with the smell of rot. A single candle burned on a table, its flame unnaturally steady despite the drafts that whispered through the room. On the table lay a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. Jacob picked it up, his hands shaking as he flipped through it. The handwriting was erratic, the words barely legible, but the message was clear: the hollow is alive. It feeds on fear, on despair. There is no escape. A sudden noise made him look up. The candle flickered, and the shadows in the room deepened. Slowly, they began to move, pooling together and rising into a shape that towered over him. The figure from the forest was here, its faceless head tilting as it regarded him. Jacob backed away, clutching the journal to his chest. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from within his own mind. The figure took a step toward him, and the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. In a final act of desperation, Jacob hurled the journal at the figure and bolted from the cabin. He ran blindly through the fog, the forest a blur around him. The whispers pursued him, growing louder, more frantic. Until they suddenly stopped, Jacob stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath. The fog was gone, and he was back at the edge of the hollow. His car sat where he'd left it, the headlights cutting through the night. He didn't question how he'd gotten back. He climbed into the car and drove, not stopping until he was miles away. When he finally pulled over, his hands still shaking, he realized he was clutching something. The journal. Its pages were blank now, but the weight of it was undeniable. Jacob never wrote the story. He left his job, moved to a city far from the mountains, and tried to forget. But at night, when the world was quiet, he could still hear the whispers, calling him back to Devil's Hollow. The next story. On the outskirts of a forgotten town lay the remnants of Blackthorn Asylum, a sprawling labyrinth of decayed stone and rusted iron. Once a sanctuary for the mentally ill, the asylum had been abandoned for nearly 50 years, its history erased from official records but kept alive in whispers and warnings. People spoke of screams in the night, of lights flickering in the empty windows, and of shadows that moved without reason. Yet, it was the promise of untold mysteries that drew Marcus Grant, a budding urban explorer, to its gates one moonless night. Marcus wasn't alone in his obsession with places like Blackthorn. His online channel, Forgotten Places, had gained a modest following. And he was always chasing the next big find. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a backpack of supplies, he climbed over the chain-link fence marked with faded signs that read, "Keep out," and "Danger, unsafe structure." The air inside the asylum grounds was heavy, almost tangible, as if the place were holding its breath. Dead ivy clung to the crumbling walls, and the broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets. Marcus' flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he filmed his introduction, his voice steady despite the nervous excitement that churned in his chest. "This is Blackthorn Asylum," he began, his voice echoing off the hollow walls. "A place abandoned for half a century, steeped in rumors of hauntings and worse. Tonight, we'll see if the stories are true." The main doors were surprisingly intact, their iron handles cold and unyielding. Marcus pushed, and the door creaked open with an almost theatrical groan. Inside, the air was colder, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. The beam of his flashlight revealed a grand foyer, its once polished floors now coated in dust and debris. A broken wheelchair lay on its side, its wheels bent and rusted. He moved cautiously, his camera recording everything. Graffiti marred the walls, but beneath it, the faded remnants of murals depicting serene countrysides and calming skies were visible. The juxtaposition was unsettling, as if the building itself were mocking the idea of peace. As Marcus ventured deeper, the silence grew oppressive, broken only by the sound of his footsteps and the occasional drip of water. The first floor yielded little more than empty rooms and shattered furniture, but the second floor. The second floor felt different. Here, the air was heavier, the darkness thicker. The doors to the patient rooms lined the hall like sentinels, some ajar, others sealed tight. Marcus paused at one room where the door hung by a single hinge. Inside, the walls were covered in scrawled messages, written in what looked like charcoal or something darker. They're watching. Read one. Don't trust the mirrors, warned another. A shiver ran down Marcus' spine, but he pressed on, narrating into his camera to keep the growing unease at bay. It's clear someone, or something, has been here. The question is, are they still here? The answer came sooner than he expected. As he turned to leave the room, his flashlight flickered. He smacked it against his palm, muttering under his breath, but when the beam stabilized, he saw a figure at the end of the hall. It was a woman, or at least it appeared to be. Her silhouette was faint, almost translucent, but her eyes burned like embers. She stood motionless, her gaze locked on Marcus. "Hello," he called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move. He raised his camera, but when he looked through the viewfinder, the hallway was empty. Lowering the camera, he saw her again, closer now. His breath hitched as the temperature plummeted. The whispers began then, soft at first, like leaves rustling in the wind. They grew louder, overlapping and indistinct, filling the hall with an unbearable cacophony. Marcus stumbled backward, his flashlight swinging wildly. When he looked again, the figure was gone, but the whispers remained, seeping into his mind like a noxious gas. He fled, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. But no matter how far he ran, the asylum seemed to stretch endlessly, its layout shifting and twisting. Rooms appeared where there had been none, and staircases led to nowhere. Panic set in as he realized he was no longer in control. The asylum had become a living thing, a predator toying with its prey. In his desperation, Marcus found himself in a large, circular room. The ceiling was domed, and in the center stood a massive iron chair bolted to the floor, its surface stained with rust and other things. Chains hung from the ceiling, their ends frayed as if something had broken free. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and Marcus could feel a presence in the room with him. Slowly, he turned, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The figure from the hallway was there. But now she was fully formed. Her skin was pallid and stretched tight over her bones, her hair a tangled mess that framed a face frozen in a rictus of pain. Her eyes, still burning embers, seemed to pierce through him. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a mixture of sorrow and anger. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, she screamed. The sound was unearthly, a blend of anguish and fury that reverberated through his very soul. The room erupted into chaos as shadows burst from the walls, writhing and clawing at him. His camera fell to the floor, its lens shattering, but it continued to record. He ran blindly, the asylum now a nightmare of endless corridors and leering shadows. His flashlight died, leaving him in total darkness. The whispers returned, now accompanied by faint laughter that echoed all around him. He could feel them closing in, unseen hands brushing against his skin, pulling at his clothes. When he finally found an exit, he burst through the doors and into the night, collapsing on the cold, wet ground. The asylum loomed behind him, its windows glowing faintly as if lit from within. The whispers followed him even there, carried on the wind. Marcus never uploaded the footage. The broken camera was found months later by another group of explorers, its memory card intact. They watched the video, their faces pale as they listened to the whispers and saw the shadows closing in. None of them ever returned to Blackthorn Asylum. But the whispers remained, spreading like a virus to anyone who dared to look too closely. The asylum still stands, waiting for its next visitor, its hunger eternal. The next story. For decades, the villagers of Blackthorn whispered about the manor at the edge of the forest. Its towering spires and cracked windows loomed like the jagged teeth of a beast, and its history was as twisted as its gnarled oak trees. They said the house had a soul, a dark consciousness that fed on the living. But no one dared to confirm the rumors. Until Daniel came. Daniel Gray was a historian, skeptical and logical to a fault. When he heard about the legends of Blackthorn Manor, he scoffed at the tales. Superstition, he declared. Every old house has its stories. Let me see the place for myself, and I'll debunk it, with little more than a flashlight, a notebook, and his trusty camera. Daniel ventured to the manor under the cover of twilight. The villagers watched him leave, their faces pale and somber. The gate screeched open, revealing a driveway carpeted with dead leaves and a house cloaked in shadow. As Daniel approached, the air grew colder, more oppressive. The once grand double doors creaked ominously as he pushed them open. Inside, the house was a mausoleum of decay. Dust blanketed every surface, and cobwebs draped from the chandeliers like morbid decorations. The scent of mold and something fouler, something metallic and acrid, hung in the air. Still, Daniel was undeterred. He began to explore, taking photographs and jotting down notes. In the library, he found books with pages glued together by time and moisture. In the dining room, the long table was set for a banquet that had never come to pass. But it was in the basement that he found the first sign of something truly unnatural. The stairs leading down were slick with moisture, the air damp and suffocating. His flashlight beam revealed claw marks gouged into the walls, as if something had tried to escape. And then there was the door. Heavy, iron-bound, and bolted from the outside. Interesting, Daniel muttered, though his voice wavered. He unlatched the bolts with shaking hands and pushed the door open. Inside was a chamber carved from black stone, its walls adorned with symbols Daniel couldn't decipher. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it rested a book bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. The air seemed to hum, a low vibration that settled deep in Daniel's bones. Against his better judgment, he opened the book. The pages were filled with arcane symbols and illustrations of grotesque figures. One page depicted a ritual circle, surrounded by shadowy forms with hollow eyes. As he stared at it, a cold breath grazed the back of his neck. Daniel spun around, but the room was empty. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled with it, cursing under his breath, when a sound cut through the silence, a low, guttural whisper, "Leave." His breath caught in his throat. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it was a cacophony of voices screaming in unison. He ran, leaving the book and his equipment behind, scrambling up the stairs and out of the manor. The villagers found Daniel the next morning, sitting at the edge of the forest. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling. He tried to speak, but all that came out were fragments, shadows, whispers. Door. That night, the manor burned. No one saw who set it ablaze, but the flames consumed it entirely. When the fire died, the villagers ventured to the ruins. Amid the ashes, they found the iron door, unscathed. It was sealed shut once more, and no one dared to open it. Daniel left Blackthorn shortly after, his once sharp mind dulled by fear. But the whispers followed him, haunting his dreams and echoing in empty rooms. And every so often, he swore he saw shadows where there should be none. The villagers. They tell their children to stay away from the ruins. They say the house may be gone, but its soul remains. And it is hungry. The next story, a shrill scream was heard in the courtyards. Meanwhile, I was busy in the garage, enjoying the spring twilight with a bottle of beer, but I didn't have time. Something that has been terrorizing us for a long time has taken someone again. And maybe I will become its victim too, but let's start from the beginning. I live in an urban-type settlement, in a 2-story house, on the 2nd floor. I got a 1-room apartment from my brother, who moved to the city. As a carefree person, I don't care where and how to live. The most important thing is to have a roof under my head and everything I need nearby. Life would be peaceful, if not for one but something wandering around the yards of our settlement. You can ask a bunch of questions, but the answer is one: no one cares. There is no need to bother your head with all these subtleties. Moreover, the settlement is close to the status of a ghost settlement. Therefore, I do not think that anyone will help us. What is this thing? You ask. If I could talk to the dead, I would answer the question, but I am not deprived of such a gift, so I cannot answer. Of course, there are those who have seen the monster, but the catch is that they all describe it differently. Sometimes a 2-meter steel alien, sometimes a Mothman, sometimes a chupacabra. The only thing that does not change in the description is the smell of fish. Lovecraft's stories with his terrible marine aesthetics immediately come to mind. Only there is no sea near the village, only one seedy river, all the fish there died. Does this count? When and how this monster appeared is unclear. People suddenly started disappearing, and abruptly and quickly, as if they had disappeared into thin air. They thought that they had simply quietly moved away, but where to was unknown. A version about a cannibal maniac appeared, and they failed again. They also searched the river, and again nothing. Then the most attentive investigator, my old school friend, noticed that the water had dropped a little and had become a little black. It happened one evening. He came to me for a beer. After a few glasses, he told me a little more. He stayed a little near the river that day. Wandered along the shore. He went a little further, where the water was too deep, and no one was swimming. It seemed to him that someone had emerged from under the water. He did not have time to really see, but he realized that there was something big in the water, and it was clearly not his imagination. He did not become a comrade to tell anything. He told me first. After that evening, rumors began to spread about a monster in our village. It is unclear where these rumors came from, but it is always easier to accept that otherworldly forces are to blame. Otherwise, how can one explain the disappearances without a trace and the smell of fish in the mornings? There was simply no other explanation. Moreover, over time, screams began to be heard at night. It became clear to everyone that it was not a person involved, but real extraterrestrial evil. It all sounds ridiculous and funny, but that is how it is. It was as if I found myself in a typical horror story. In total, 10 people were missing, 11 if you include tonight. I would probably be the 12th. Clicking sounds came from the courtyards. Something was approaching the garage cooperative. I hid in the darkness of the garage, trying not to even breathe. The clicking sound kept coming closer and closer. And then this monster appeared in front of me. A giant crustacean creature without a head. Its pointed legs loudly clicked on the ground, shaking everything around it. Its pincers, real crushers with teeth, clicked, every now and then hitting something. An orange light shone from the hole where the head should have been, as if from the underworld. The pale flesh pulsated, small tentacles wriggled, basking in the hellish light. Various body parts of the victims protruded from this flesh. Someone was still alive and calling for help, but their pleas were not heard over the guttural growl. I don't know what saved me then, the sharp smell of gasoline and diesel fuel or lady luck. The monster stood there for a minute and moved on. I sat in the garage until the morning. As soon as the first rays of the sun appeared, I went back to repairing my car with the goal of escaping from here. I'll move in with my brother, stay with him for a while until I find a place to live. Yes, that's how it will be. I'll figure out how to deal with that apartment somehow. I'll come up with a reason to move. But I don't intend to stay here any longer. It was enough for me to see the one who steals people at night.